So you've decided to host a dinner party in Victorian Britain. That single decision might sound innocent, but it's the social equivalent of stepping into quicksand wearing silk shoes. Because in this era, an invitation wasn't a polite request, it was a public announcement that your household was ready to be judged by people who ironed their opinions as sharply as their napkins. The moment you sent one, your family's financial health entered hospice care. Victorians didn't send invitations. They sent financial warrants disguised in calligraphy. The paper alone could bleed your budget dry. It had to be heavy, creamy, and scented faintly of, "I'm better than you." Printing was an art, done by specialised stationers who charged more per card than some families spent on meat in a month. The ink couldn't just be black. It had to glisten slightly, like ambition. Even the script mattered. Too ornate, and you looked nouveau riche. Too plain, and you looked middle class, which to a Victorian was basically a cry for help. Some families even imported paper from France because nothing said I'm respectable like going into debt for stationery. And then came timing, an exact science only rivalled by the Victorian mourning periods. Send invitations too early and it screamed desperation. Too late and it whispered incompetence. The sweet spot? Roughly 2 weeks, just enough time for gossip to build anticipation, but not enough for someone richer to schedule their own party and steal your guests. Because yes, even your dinner invitation could be socially outflanked. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Crafting the guest list was where ambition met terror. It was a balancing act between who could elevate your status and who wouldn't notice your chipped porcelain. Invite too many elites, and they'd smell the financial fear in the air. Too many equals, and you'd appear dull. Too many relatives, and you'd look like you couldn't attract better company. Ideally, you wanted a duke, a clergyman, one token intellectual, and maybe a charming widow who could keep conversation lively, but not too lively. One misstep, one wrong name on that parchment, and you'd risk your social ecosystem collapsing faster than your souffle would later that night. But this wasn't just about who came, it was about who saw you trying. Dinner parties weren't acts of generosity, they were acts of survival. In a world where your position in society depended on being seen behaving properly, the invitation was both your advertisement and your gamble. Decline to host at all, and people assumed you were broke. Host too lavishly, and they assumed you were pretending not to be. The only winning move was to lose gracefully, ideally while surrounded by 12 guests and an unpaid bill from the wine merchant. Once those envelopes hit the post, the anxiety began. The mailman became your messenger of fate. Each day you'd hover by the window, praying for responses. Elegant little cards marked "accepts with pleasure" that meant one thing only: panic. Because every acceptance meant another mouth to feed, another bottle of imported claret to procure, another reason to rehearse how to smile while slowly dying inside. But worse than acceptance was silence. No reply meant either insult or indifference, and both were fatal in a society that valued politeness over honesty. A missing RSVP could haunt a hostess more than an unpaid mortgage. And let's not forget the RSVP itself, the most terrifying 4 letters in the English language. Victorians weaponised etiquette, and declining an invitation was an art form. A regretfully detained in the country really meant your food was bad last time, and unfortunately engaged elsewhere, translated to your husband's jokes are unbearable. Every reply, or lack of one, carried layers of coded meaning, all of them expensive. To make matters worse, once you sent those invitations, you were financially and morally committed. There was no backing out. Cancelling would be social suicide, the equivalent of standing up in church and announcing that your accounts were overdrawn. You'd be whispered about for years. Poor Mrs. Farnsworth cancelled her dinner, you know, couldn't even afford the soup course. And so Victorians hosted. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Because reputation was everything, and an invitation was proof that you still had one. A dinner party wasn't just a meal, it was a performance, a display of controlled chaos meant to convince others that you were thriving, even if the only thing truly thriving was your debt. The irony? The higher the class, the greater the terror. The working class couldn't afford to host and were too busy surviving to care. The middle class hosted to prove they'd arrived, and the upper class? They hosted because they feared they might fall. The dinner table was an altar, and social status the deity being sacrificed to one invitation at a time, so the next time you receive a dinner invitation, be glad you live in the present. You can politely decline with a text and a crying emoji. A Victorian couldn't. They'd already mortgaged their sanity just to send the card. Before the first fork was polished or the first candle lit, a Victorian host faced their most dangerous challenge, the guest list. Forget the menu, that could be blamed on the cook. Forget the decor, that could be explained away as understated taste. But the guest list, that was social dynamite. Choosing the wrong combination of names could annihilate your reputation faster than you could say, pass the aspic. In Victorian Britain, status wasn't something you owned. It was something loaned to you temporarily by the people you dined with, and one wrong invite could send it back with interest. Every dinner party was a balancing act between ego and economics. Invite too high above your station, and you risked humiliation so refined it was practically an art form. Invite too low, and you risked being labelled middling. The Victorians despised middling. It meant you were ambitious enough to climb, but clumsy enough to slip. Your social circle wasn't just a reflection of your taste, it was your life insurance. Because in this world, you didn't network, you navigated. The first step was deciding who was safe. Safe meant someone of equal or slightly higher rank who wouldn't notice your slightly outdated wallpaper, or the fact that your wine glasses came in a set of 7 because one broke in 1873, but every host dreamed of one impossible guest, someone just above them on the social ladder. A minor aristocrat, a titled widow, a colonel's wife with a fondness for gossip, anyone who could make the guest list sparkle with borrowed prestige. Of course, that to glitter came at a price. The higher the title, the greater the scrutiny. You could invite the local baronet, yes, but only if your dining chairs didn't squeak and your servant uniforms had actual buttons. Invite a marquis, and you'd better hope your wine cellar didn't echo. Invite a duke, and you'd better have a second mortgage. Some families even hired guest consultants, people who advised on which social combinations could elevate or destroy you. Because it wasn't enough to invite people. You had to curate them. The right mix was crucial. A dinner full of aristocrats was stiff and intimidating, like eating soup in a museum. A dinner full of tradesmen was too comfortable, like admitting you actually worked for a living. A successful dinner had to feel like a perfectly balanced seesaw, one side offering prestige, the other ensuring you didn't look like you were trying too hard to reach it. But there were subtler traps. You couldn't invite a duchess without also inviting someone of comparable rank, or the duchess might feel insulted to sit next to mere money. You couldn't invite a newly rich merchant without pairing him with someone titled, so his wealth could be socially laundered. And you definitely couldn't seat 2 women who had once courted the same gentleman unless you enjoyed emotional fireworks with your dessert course. And heaven help you if you forgot someone important. Exclusion was its own scandal. A family could spend years rebuilding their reputation after accidentally leaving out a key local figure. Worse still was the deliberate snub, the social equivalent of a duel at dawn. Failing to invite someone who expected to be invited was an act of war. London society ran on invisibly linked favours and vendettas, and one misstep in your guest selection could make you the subject of whispered mockery from Kensington to Bath. For the middle classes, who were still hammering their way into respectability, guest lists were weapons of aspiration. You invited slightly higher than yourself to signal ambition, and slightly lower to make sure someone was impressed. Every name on the list was a rung on the ladder. A clergyman gave moral credibility. A doctor brought intellectual gravitas. A military officer added a whiff of heroism. And a titled lady, even a third cousin twice removed from nobility, was worth her weight in gilt-edged invitations. The working-class families who'd struck gold through trade, the new money crowd, faced the hardest challenge. Old families treated them with suspicion, so they had to bribe their way into social circles using food, drink, and charm. Their guest lists read like wishful thinking. 1 bishop, 2 colonels, and a novelist who might pretend to have heard of us. They spent fortunes on dinners designed purely to convince others they belonged, even when the others came only to mock them. But here's the cruelest twist. Even if you got the mix right, you couldn't please everyone. Someone would inevitably complain that the seating order was offensive. Someone else would declare that the soup was too hot, the company too cold, and the host's laugh too eager. Victorians weaponized politeness. A guest could destroy you with a raised eyebrow. The gossip that followed a bad dinner was its own form of social execution. "Lovely house," they'd say sweetly, which really meant, "How sad they can't afford curtains." Hosts developed strategies to minimize disaster. Some kept spare invitations ready for social emergencies, last-minute replacements if an important guest declined. Others hired servants to discreetly gather gossip about which families were feuding, ensuring they wouldn't seat enemies next to each other. There were even guidebooks published with advice on proper guest combinations, warning readers not to mix military men with politicians, too opinionated, or bachelors with widows, too opinionated for different reasons. Still, even the most careful host couldn't control what happened once the dining room door closed. Guests arrived armed with smiles, secrets, and simmering rivalries. The wrong mix could detonate spectacularly, and when it did, you could bet the gossip columns would know by morning. Choosing guests was like defusing a bomb. One wrong-titled person and the whole evening exploded in gossip. The guest list is finished, the invitations are sent, and now the real nightmare begins, the preparations. A Victorian dinner party wasn't just an evening event. It was a full-scale domestic invasion that started weeks in advance. Once the RSVPs rolled in, the household transformed into a battlefield of dust, deadlines, and despair. Every corner of the home became a war zone, where cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was next to solvency. Because make no mistake, a dinner party wasn't about feeding people. It was about performing respectability. The dining room, the drawing room, even the hallway umbrella stand, all of it became evidence in the ongoing trial of your social worth. Guests weren't simply coming to eat, they were coming to inspect, and inspection was what the Victorians did best. The first order of business was cleaning, the kind of cleaning that would make modern spring cleaners weep. Everything had to shine, sparkle, or at least look recently scrubbed by a desperate servant. Curtains were taken down and beaten into submission. Silverware was polished until it reflected your mounting anxiety. Even the cat wasn't safe. More than one Victorian memoir includes stories of family pets being brushed, perfumed, or temporarily exiled for shedding too visibly. If your wallpaper didn't smell faintly of lavender and fear, were you even Victorian? But the cleaning was only the beginning. Furniture had to be rearranged with military precision. Every chair was tested for creaks. Nothing could betray poverty like a wobbly seat beneath a minor aristocrat. Tablecloths were inspected under daylight, because even a faint stain could whisper domestic failure. Some families went so far as to borrow furniture or rugs from neighbours, just to make the illusion complete. Imagine the chaos when an armchair was returned late and the neighbours needed it for their dinner party. Victorian households lived in a constant state of polite panic, each trying to outdo the other while pretending not to. Then came the hiring frenzy. A single dinner party could require an entire temporary workforce. Extra servants were brought in on short-term contracts, footmen, parlourmaids, scullery boys, all hired just to make one evening look seamless. A family of modest means might suddenly have a small army of people they didn't know polishing, carrying, and silently judging them. These temporary staffers were nicknamed feather footmen, because they floated from house to house, hired by the panicked and the socially ambitious. They were the gig workers of their age, except instead of laptops, they carried trays. The hostess, meanwhile, became a general under siege. Her job was to ensure the illusion of calm while everyone beneath her lost their minds. She supervised flower arrangements, debated whether the crystal glasses were too French, and agonised over napkin folds. Yes, napkin folds. Victorians believed the fold of your napkin revealed your morals character. A well-creased fan fold said elegance, a simple triangle said provincial, a poorly done bishop's mitre said prepare to be ostracised. And then there was the food. Even before the cook began, the shopping itself was an ordeal. Every ingredient was a logistical nightmare. Fresh fish had to be ordered from Billingsgate Market at dawn and delivered on ice before it smelled like low morals. Imported spices and wines had to be secured on credit, with merchants muttering behind your back about whether your family would ever pay them. The kitchen was a cauldron of activity, and occasionally of actual fire. The coal stove burned all day, the maids darted around like caffeinated moths, and the cook alternated between genius and breakdown. Servants below stairs suffered most. The scullery maid scrubbed pots until her hands looked like geography lessons. The butler inspected every decanter for dust and every fork for symmetry. The housemaid was told to make the hallway shine like heaven, a cruel order, since heaven didn't have carpets. And still, the mistress of the house hovered, adding to the pressure. She'd trail her gloved fingers along mantelpieces, tutting at invisible specks of dust. Heaven forbid she find one. A single missed cobweb could undo weeks of labour, and worse, her composure. Upstairs, the master of the house had his own panic. His role was to appear calm, jovial, and financially solvent, none of which he actually was. He practised cheerful laughter in the mirror and checked his reflection for confidence wrinkles. He pretended not to hear his wife shouting at the parlour-maid for rearranging the ferns incorrectly. Yes, even the plants were curated. Too few, and your home looked barren. Too many, and it looked like colonial overcompensation. And oh, the obsession with scent. The Victorians were terrified of bad smells. The wrong odour could ruin an evening faster than bad gossip. So the air was thick with lavender, rosewater, vinegar, and panic. Guests would arrive to a home so heavily perfumed it felt like walking into an herbalist's fever dream. People didn't breathe. They politely suffocated. The final week before the dinner, it was a descent into madness. The hostess stopped sleeping, the servants stopped smiling, and the cats stopped showing up. Candles had to be measured for even mum gives a height, decanters refilled, and wine labels turned outward. Everyone rehearsed movements like actors before opening night, except the stakes weren't applause but survival. And yet, amid the chaos, there was a strange beauty in it. The Victorians genuinely believed that order, polish, and perfection could elevate them, that the right arrangement of flowers and forks could momentarily erase the grinding realities of industrial life. The dinner party was an illusion of grace powered by anxiety and elbow grease. By the evening of the event, the house gleamed, the servants trembled, and the host smiled with the serenity of people one candle away from collapse. Every carpet had been beaten, every curtain rehung, and every ounce of dignity stretched thin. It was, in its own exhausting way, magnificent. If your wallpaper didn't smell faintly of lavender and fear, were you even Victorian? The invitations were sent, the guest list finalised, and the panic firmly installed in every corner of the household. Now came the most delicate part of all, assembling the servants. For one glorious evening, a Victorian family had to convince their guests they lived in smooth, genteel efficiency, not barely controlled domestic chaos. The problem? Most families didn't have nearly enough staff to pull it off, and so began the age-old ritual of borrowing, begging, and outright bribing to fill the ranks. Victorian homes were powered by servants the way modern homes are powered by electricity, and when that current ran low, everything flickered. For a respectable dinner party, you needed an entire cast, a butler to manage the wine, a footman to serve each course, a parlour-maid to hover gracefully, a cook to orchestrate the feast, and at least one unfortunate scullery maid to wash away the evidence. The trouble was, very few middle-class families could afford this line-up year-round. Many had a cook, a maid-of-all-work, and possibly a boy for errand, if the economy had been kind that month. But when 12 guests were expected, that humble team looked dangerously insufficient. so families improvised. Wealthier friends were quietly approached and favours discreetly exchanged. It was common for a hostess to send a note reading, "Might we borrow your second footman for Thursday evening?" A polite way of saying we're pretending to be richer than we are. Please help maintain the illusion. Servants became currency, traded between households like chess pieces in a game of social survival. For the servants, this was both opportunity and nightmare. They might find themselves serving in a stranger's home, wearing a borrowed uniform, and learning names moments before guests arrived. Imagine a footman nodding solemnly as the host whispered, "That's Mrs. Blythe, not Miss Blythe. Don't mix them up or we're ruined." Nothing says stable household like a footman who learned your name 15 minutes ago. Temporary hires were another solution. There were entire agencies, domestic registries, that specialised in renting out servants for an evening. You could hire a butler by the night, a maid by the hour, or even a valet who would pretend to know which fork came first. Of course, these professionals came at a price, and worse, at risk. Some had impeccable manners and silent efficiency. Others had questionable sobriety and flexible definitions of clean glassware. Still, hosts preferred the risk of the shame of being caught understaffed. And then there was the most desperate tactic, borrowing servants from below. Cooks pulled in cousins, maids enlisted sisters, and errand boys were suddenly promoted to assistant footmen with no clue what that meant. Kitchens filled with strangers, all speaking in different dialects and operating at different speeds. A well-prepared Victorian kitchen on dinner night looked less like Downton Abbey and more like organised pandemonium in aprons. This chaos extended to uniforms. Real households had matching livery, dark coats, silver buttons, crisp white gloves. Borrowed or temporary servants rarely did. So sleeves were hastily rolled, buttons polished, and aprons bleached to unify the illusion. It wasn't unusual for a servant to be dressed entirely in borrowed clothing, sweating under too tight collars, and performing polite invisibility while secretly plotting escape. The butler, the general of this army, bore the brunt of the stress. His job was to make everything appear effortless, to glide between the dining room and the cellar like a ghost made of etiquette. But even the best butler couldn't disguise a team assembled from panic. One footman was too tall, another too slow, and someone inevitably dropped a tray. Still the butler soldiered on, face impassive, soul screaming. For the cook, the problem wasn't performance, it was diplomacy. Cooks had pride, and nothing insulted them more than an invasion of help from another kitchen. They tolerated borrowed servants the way cats tolerate guests, stiffly, resentfully, and with a promise of future vengeance. A borrowed scullery maid might find herself elbow-deep in dishes, while the cook muttered darkly about outsiders ruining her rhythm. And heaven help the poor temporary footman who dared to comment on her gravy. The mistress of the house, meanwhile, walked a tightrope of appearances. She had to appear calm and composed upstairs while chaos reigned below. She smiled sweetly at her guests, pretending her household always ran with clockwork grace, even as she prayed the borrowed butler remembered to uncork the wine after grace was said this time. In her mind, every clink of silverware was a gunshot of potential embarrassment. Of course, this borrowing economy had an unspoken rule: reciprocity. If you borrowed servants, you were expected to return the favour. That meant the following week, your own maid might vanish to serve in someone else's grand illusion. Entire neighbourhoods existed in these quiet networks of exchanged labour, each household pretending to be wealthier than it really was, sustained by a delicate ecosystem of mutual pretence. And when all else failed, when every borrowed servant was already booked, every neighbour politely declined, and the cook threatened mutiny, some hosts resorted to hiring actors. Yes, actors. Out-of-work stagehands and bit players could be found in London's back streets, willing to don livery and carry trays for an evening, provided there was coin in it. The results were often spectacularly awkward, bowing too low, calling guests by the wrong titles, or offering cigars during the soup course. But to the desperate it was better than the unthinkable alternative, being seen pouring one's own wine. By the time guests arrived, the servants had been drilled like soldiers. Each had a designated role, a list of names, and one unifying goal: make it through the night without anyone realising half of them didn't belong. And somehow, miraculously, most did. Dinner parties glided by in polished grace, while behind the scenes, temporary alliances, secret favours, and borrowed dignity held everything together with trembling precision. Victorian domestic life was an illusion, and on dinner night, that illusion depended entirely on borrowed hands. The guests saw nothing but refinement, order, and calm civility. They didn't see the panic, the bribes, or the sheer logistical madness that kept the illusion alive. Nothing says stable household like a footman who learned your name 15 minutes ago. By the time the guests finally crossed the threshold, the host's pulse was somewhere between panic and prayer. The servants were in position, the food, hopefully, edible, and now all that stood between social triumph and ruin was the room itself, the sacred arena of Victorian dinner warfare, the dining room. This wasn't just a space for eating. It was a coliseum where class anxiety battled self-delusion. Every fork, curtain and candle holder screamed either success or bankruptcy. Victorians didn't eat dinner. They auditioned for financial collapse. To the 19th century eye, the dining room was a public confession of wealth, taste, and moral stability. The Victorians genuinely believed that beauty and virtue were connected, and nothing declared virtue like a perfectly symmetrical table setting surrounded by furniture that looked more expensive than the mortgage it concealed. It wasn't enough for guests to feel comfortable. They had to feel impressed. And that meant every inch of the room had to whisper, "This family matters." Or if not that, at least, "This family has a chandeliers to debt ratio worth respecting." For the newly rich, the dining room was their stage debut in society's ongoing drama of respectability. Architects and decorators made small fortunes designing these shrines to excess. Heavy mahogany tables large enough to seat a minor parliament dominated the centre. Walls were covered in patterned wallpaper so intricate it could cause mild dizziness. And everywhere, there were mirrors. Big gleaming mirrors meant to double the illusion of grandeur and the candlelight, since gas lamps were still a fire hazard waiting to happen. The irony, of course, was that those mirrors mostly reflected everyone's shared anxiety about how much all this cost. Furniture was selected like ammunition in a status war. A proper dining chair had to be solid, upholstered, and uncomfortable enough to remind guests that this was formality, not relaxation. The table itself was a monolith of social aspiration, polished within an inch of its life and large enough to make conversation feel like long-distance correspondence. On top of it went the true weapons of prestige, cutlery and crystal. Silverware wasn't just functional, it was symbolic. A real Victorian host owned enough forks to feed a small army, each designed for one specific purpose. There was a fork for fish, one for salad, another for dessert, and yet another for the course you couldn't afford but served anyway. Guests were expected to know which was which. Hosts were expected to pretend they didn't care if you didn't. Of course, they absolutely did. The hierarchy of forks mirrored the hierarchy of society, intricate, confusing, and designed to keep everyone slightly terrified of making the wrong move. Then came the china, the glasses, and the napery, collectively known as the table service, though it might as well have been the mortgage. Imported porcelain was a must for those pretending to continental refinement. Glassware gleamed in delicate shades of anxiety. Each place setting had to be perfectly symmetrical, every knife pointing at the same invisible line. A misplaced spoon wasn't just bad form, it was a scandal in miniature. And oh, the lighting. The Victorian dinner table glowed like an altar. Dozens of candles burned in ornate candelabra, melting steadily through your savings. The right candlelight made skin look warm and wealth look plausible. Too dim, and your guests might miss the gilding on the frames. Too bright, and they might notice the cracks in the plaster. It was a fine art, one that often ended in near suffocation, as ventilation was sacrificed to maintain the aesthetic of cosy splendour. Even the draperies were part of the arms race. Curtains weren't simply fabric, they were financial statements. The heavier the velvet, the richer the illusion. Some were so thick they practically blocked sound, light, and hope. Patterned carpets covered the floors, partly for warmth but mostly to signal that the host had enough money to put intricate textiles where people's feet would trample them. Every square inch of the dining room screamed, "We are doing fine. Please ignore the pawn ticket in the desk drawer." For the hosts, the most terrifying part was knowing that their guests would see through it all, because every guest was running the same performance. They would sit politely, sipping wine, mentally assessing everything from the curtain's hemline to the decanter's clarity. A smudge on a glass wasn't just dirt, it was a moral failing. A cheap centrepiece might as well have been a confession of bankruptcy. Dinner conversation floated politely above the table, but beneath it ran a silent current of appraisal and comparison. And yet, amid all this pressure, the Victorians found creative ways to cope. Some simply leaned into the absurdity. If they couldn't afford real gold leaf on the frames, they painted wood with cheap gilding paste and hoped the candlelight blurred the difference. Others rented tableware from specialised firms that catered to the chronically overambitious. You could rent crystal decanters, silver tureens, even fake French clocks to display on your mantel for the evening. The 19th century version of social media filters. Of course, not everyone was fooled. Seasoned guests could spot rented elegance instantly. "Too new," they'd whisper about the silverware, or "too shiny" about the china, as if true wealth came with the right amount of wear and tear. The paradox of Victorian taste was that everything had to look simultaneously brand new and ancient, expensive yet inherited, a perfect facade of imperfection. But for all its pretense, there was a certain tragic nobility to it. These families weren't just decorating rooms, they were constructing identities. In an age obsessed with progress, class, and moral worth, the dining room was the theatre of their aspirations. Behind every over-polished chair and over-decorated mantel was a family desperately trying to prove that they belonged in a world that measured belonging by chandeliers and table length. As the guests sat down, the room shimmered with ambition. The candles flickered, the silver glinted, and the host smiled through clenched teeth. The illusion was complete, at least until the first servant tripped or the soup arrived lukewarm. But for now, the stage was perfect. Victorians didn't eat dinner, they auditioned for financial collapse. If the Victorian dining room was a battlefield of wealth, then the table was its front line, and the weapons were forks. A dinner party wasn't truly successful until the host had arranged the cutlery so precisely that Pythagoras himself would have wept. The table setting wasn't just decoration, it was a declaration of intelligence, taste, and borderline obsession. The Victorians turned dining into geometry, and the table into a mathematical equation no one dared solve incorrectly. By the late 1800s, etiquette manuals read less like guides and more like blueprints. Every object had a position measured in fractions of an inch. Forks to the left, knives to the right, spoons above the plate, dessert forks perpendicular. The entire layout looked less like preparation for dinner and more like a military campaign in stainless steel. If your table didn't resemble a small artillery layout, your guests assumed you were poor. But it wasn't just about placement, it was about symbolism. The Victorians adored rules. Rules made chaos feel elegant, and dinner table geometry became their favourite form of control. A perfectly aligned knife wasn't just practical, it suggested discipline, breeding, and moral stability. Crooked cutlery, on the other hand, hinted at moral decay. Heaven forbid your teaspoon looked rebellious. Let's start with the basics. The plate, or as the Victorians would call it, the service plate. It sat in the centre like a throne, never actually used for food, but serving as a marker of refinement. On top of it went the first course plate, the napkin, folded with engineering precision, and occasionally a delicate name card written in elegant calligraphy. Guests approached the table as though entering a sacred site, and in a way, they were. To sit at such a table was to participate in a ritual of precision disguised as dinner. Every setting had its choreography. The tablecloth, for instance, had to fall exactly 9 inches from the edge of the table, no more, no less, so that diners could cross their legs without grazing fabric but still feel enveloped by civility. Napkins were folded into elaborate shapes. Fans, lilies, bishops' mitres, sometimes even swans. A dinner party wasn't complete unless one napkin looked like a minor architectural marvel. Some hosts even hired professionals to fold them, because folding the wrong way could say more about your moral fibre than your church attendance. The glassware alone could give a mathematician a nervous breakdown. You didn't just have one glass, you had a whole ecosystem of them. The water goblet went directly above the knife. To its right, a smaller glass for white wine, next to that, one for red wine. Then, just to show off, a champagne flute perched at a jaunty angle like a proud peacock. And heaven help you if you use them in the wrong order. A guest who reached for the red wine glass during the fish course might as well have announced they were raised by wolves. The silverware was even more terrifying. It wasn't enough to own it. You had to deploy it correctly. A 12-course meal required up to 20 pieces of cutlery per person, each with a purpose so specific it bordered on absurdity. There were forks for oysters, for salad, for fish, for the entree, for dessert, and one lonely fork that no one could remember the purpose of but dared not remove. Each knife had its own blade shape, some curved, some flat, some serrated like miniature saws. Guests were expected to know which to use instinctively, or at least to copy their neighbour discreetly. And then there was the centrepiece, the glittering heart of the whole operation. A floral arrangement was the most common choice, but not just any flowers. Victorians loved symbolism, so every bloom carried meaning. Roses whispered romance, lilies purity, and ferns, which Victorians adored almost to obsession, conveyed taste and wealth. But too many flowers, and you looked nouveau riche. Too few, and you looked like you'd just emerged from bankruptcy. To make matters worse, you had to ensure the arrangement was tall enough to impress, but short enough for guests to see over. There were stories of dinners where guests spent the entire evening speaking to bouquets instead of each other. Even the space between objects mattered. A host was expected to leave exactly 2 inches between each setting. Plates should form a perfect line, as though surveyed by a small and angry architect. This level of precision meant that some families spent entire afternoons just measuring the table. Servants crawled around with rulers and string, ensuring that every spoon gleamed at precisely the same angle. One slip and all that geometry collapsed into chaos, and by extension, disgrace. Candle holders also followed invisible laws. The number of candles had to be even, odd numbers were thought vulgar, and they had to be spaced evenly so that light reflected beautifully off the silver. The flames danced softly across crystal and porcelain, turning dinner into a carefully staged theatre of flickering respectability. But those same flames also melted wax onto the tablecloth, setting off silent servant panics mid-meal. Etiquette demanded serenity, but dinner often resembled controlled combustion. And through it all, the host had to act like this precision came naturally, as if every symmetrical napkin and mathematically aligned fork was the spontaneous result of their refined soul. No one could see the hours of labour, the whispered arguments about centrepiece height, or the butler's near breakdown over misaligned glasses. The illusion was everything, but that was Victorian life in miniature, an age obsessed with surface order, in a world spinning with industrial chaos. Behind the laughter and the tinkling crystal, there was the constant fear of being exposed as tasteless, unrefined, or worst of all, middle class. So by the time guests finally took their seats, the table gleamed like a monument to human neurosis. Every reflection, every petal, every knife edge sang the same desperate hymn. We are civilized. Please believe us. If your table didn't resemble a small artillery layout, your guests assumed you were poor. By the time the guests had marvelled at the glittering table and politely pretended not to notice the host's twitching eye, it was time for the true heart of the evening, the meal itself. And in Victorian Britain, a dinner party menu wasn't a simple list of dishes, it was an existential declaration. It said, I am refined, worldly, and financially reckless. The more elaborate the menu, the greater the host's social standing, and the smaller their chances of ever paying off their butcher's bill. Each bite of that pheasant tasted like future debt. Victorian dining was built on excess. A proper dinner didn't have courses, it had campaigns. 7 courses were respectable, 10 were ambitious, 12 was impressive. Anything beyond that suggested either aristocratic grandeur or full-blown delusion. And every course had to escalate. No repeats, no shortcuts, no admitting you'd already served something with gravy. The meal typically began with a flourish. Soup, usually clear consommé or the ever-fashionable turtle soup, yes, real turtle. The Victorians had a disturbing fondness for it, importing live turtles across oceans just to boil them into status symbols. When turtles grew scarce and debt abundant, families resorted to mock turtle soup, made from calf's head, a cheaper substitute that didn't fool anyone. The irony was that both versions tasted like regret and gelatin, but etiquette demanded you serve it anyway. After soup came fish because nothing said refinement like something that smelled faintly of the Thames. Salmon, sole, or trout were common for those near rivers. For the ambitious exotic imports such as turbot were a must, best served with elaborate sauces whose French names alone justified the expense. A middle-class hostess might quietly pray that her guests wouldn't notice she'd bought yesterday's catch and disguised it under a mountain of cream. Then came the entree, or, as Victorians preferred to call it, the course that might destroy your credit. These were small but luxurious dishes, often French-inspired. Think lamb cutlets, sweetbreads, or fillets of game birds draped in truffle sauce. The more foreign the name, the better. Even if no one could pronounce blanquette de veau correctly, they could at least feel superior attempting it. French cuisine was the height of fashion, even if it confused most diners into silence. After that came the roast, the centerpiece of the meal, a parade of roasted meat so excessive it could feed a small village. Beef, mutton, venison, or pheasant took turns as the star attraction. The Victorians loved pheasant, partly because it was delicious, but mostly because it was expensive and therefore socially nutritious. Each roast was served with gravies, relishes, and side dishes designed to make sure no plate ever looked lonely. By this point in the evening, the average guest had consumed more protein than a modern weightlifter and was still only halfway through. The removes followed. Large, impressive dishes swapped between courses, designed to make the table look perpetually abundant. A calf's head stuffed with oysters? Perfect. A whole boar's head glazed with fruit? Delightful. The goal wasn't to feed guests. It was to make them believe you owned a personal farm, a personal chef, and a personal disregard for financial logic. Then came game. Wild birds, rabbits, and the occasional hare. These dishes were meant to show that your family not only had money, but connections. Hunting rights were still a mark of social class, and serving game was shorthand for we're the kind of people who can shoot dinner on our own estate, even if we actually bought it from the market. By now, the guests were full to the point of hallucination, but the Victorians weren't done yet, not even close. The entremets arrived next, lighter dishes that acted as edible punctuation before dessert, savoury jellies, croquettes, or tiny vegetable sculptures. The kind of food that looked like art and tasted like effort. These were the palate cleansers, though the only thing most people wanted cleansed by this point was their conscience. And then came the grand finale, dessert. This wasn't the simple cake and coffee situation we know today. No, dessert was a sugar opera, mountains of moulded gelatin, towers of spun sugar, pyramids of fruit, and trifles layered with enough brandy to start a small fire. Pineapples, or the most fashionable fruit of the century, sat proudly at the centre like edible trophies. Owning or even renting one was a sign that you had arrived or were about to leave, financially speaking. Of course, no Victorian meal was complete without wine, and lots of it. The average menu demanded at least 5 varieties, each to be served at a specific moment. Sherry with soup, white wine with fish, claret with meat, champagne for toasts, and port to close the evening. Each bottle represented a tiny act of financial martyrdom. Hosts didn't buy wine because they wanted it. They bought it because people might notice if they didn't. And they poured generously, if only to distract guests from the slight smell of desperation rising from the roast. Middle-class hosts often went to absurd lengths to mimic aristocratic menus. They'd spend weeks studying recipes, substituting ingredients, and praying their guests couldn't tell mock duck from the real thing. Many households cooked meals that required more coal, butter, and manpower than they could reasonably afford. There are records of families taking out short-term loans just to fund dinner parties, gambling that social success would somehow lead to economic salvation. It usually didn't. The result was a spectacle of culinary theatre, dishes paraded in, servants trembling under the weight of tureens, hosts smiling bravely through exhaustion. By the end, everyone was stuffed, light-haired, and vaguely aware that they had just participated in something magnificent and deranged. The Victorians didn't just eat, they performed. Every plate was a line in the play, every sauce a desperate flourish of prestige. The taste was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the impression, the illusion that this was effortless, that your family was one of abundance, elegance, and excellent gravy. Each bite of that pheasant tasted like future debt. Behind the glittering dining room doors, where candlelight danced across crystal and guests politely pretended to understand French menu terms, lurked another world, hot, loud, and faintly smoky. The kitchen. It was here, far from the polite hum of conversation, that the true drama of the Victorian dinner party unfolded. Because if the dining room was theatre, the kitchen was trench warfare. Pots boiled, tempers flared, and one small mistake could transform an ambitious soirée into social ruin. The only thing more unstable than a soufflé was the cook's mental state. Victorian cooks occupied a strange and perilous position in the household hierarchy. They were indispensable yet invisible, the engines of elegance who existed mostly to be blamed. A good cook could elevate a family's reputation faster than any inheritance. A bad one could undo it in a single source. The trouble was, most cooks lived under pressure that would break an Olympic athlete. They weren't just making dinner. They were performing nightly miracles in corsets, coal smoke and chaos. The kitchen itself was no paradise. Forget gleaming marble counters and ergonomic layouts. The average Victorian kitchen was a subterranean furnace. It was built below stairs, literally and socially, with ceilings low enough to make you stoop and heat intense enough to melt morality. There was no ventilation beyond the occasional open door, which meant that by the time the roast was ready, so was the cook, medium rare. The centrepiece of this inferno was the coal range, an unpredictable monster that devoured fuel, smoked like a factory, and required constant attention. Temperature control, that was a fantasy. If the coal burned too hot, the pudding boiled over. Too cold, and the soufflé sulked into despair. A skilled cook didn't just prepare food, she negotiated with fire. It was part artistry, part pyromania, and yet hosts expected perfection. Every dish had to arrive at precisely the right moment, at precisely the right temperature, as if orchestrated by divine timing. The challenge was staggering. A 12-course meal meant dozens of separate components, sauces simmering, fish poaching, pastries rising all at once. The cook stood at the centre of this storm, commanding a small army of assistants. The scullery maid scrubbing pans, the kitchen maid peeling vegetables, and the errand boy darting about like a soot-covered messenger of doom. Cooks were known for their temperaments, and rightly so. They had to manage chaos with military precision, while being treated as both invaluable and inferior. The butler looked down on them, the housekeeper resented them, and the mistress of the house feared them, but never dared admit it. A skilled cook could quit without notice and sink a household's reputation overnight. Employers tiptoed around them like diplomats at peace talks. The kitchen bell might ring upstairs, but downstairs, the real alarm was the sound of the cook muttering. Pay rarely reflected the pressure. Even in well-off homes, cooks earned less than the butler, despite feeding everyone who mattered. Their compensation came not in money but in influence. A cook who could produce flawless sauces and perfect pastry held quiet power. They knew every weakness of the household, every unpaid bill, every delayed order, every secret argument heard through the floorboards. Some wielded their knowledge like a shield, others like a weapon. There are recorded cases of cooks blackmailing employers, not for greed, but for dignity. Yet not all cooks were temperamental tyrants. Many were exhausted geniuses. They memorized hundreds of recipes, managed inventory without refrigeration, and turned cheap cuts of meat into works of edible architecture. Recipe books of the era, like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, offered both instruction and intimidation. Page after page of elaborate dishes that no single human could realistically produce without divine assistance. A simple dinner might list 4 soups, 3 entrees, and 2 puddings, not including the hors d'oeuvres or the inevitable remove. For middle-class families, hiring a French cook was the ultimate social upgrade. French cuisine was the gold standard, and nothing impressed guests like hearing the words à la mode de Paris. Unfortunately, it also came with communication problems. Countless households employed cooks who barely spoke English, leading to tragic misunderstandings like boiled pigeon with jam or fish pudding. Still, French cooks were prized because their accent alone made food sound more expensive. When disaster struck, and it always did, the kitchen became an emotional crime scene. A curdled sauce could bring tears. A burned roast could provoke existential despair. Entire menus were known to collapse moments before serving, forcing last-minute improvisations. A ruined dish wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat to the household's social survival. Guests upstairs might sip wine and gossip about politics, unaware that below them the cook was performing culinary triage like a battlefield surgeon. Servants dreaded the cook's temper. Pans flew, spoons clattered, and language became creatively unprintable. One witness described a dinner where the cook, upon discovering the under-butler had forgotten to chill the jelly, threw a ladle with the precision of a marksman and the venom of a scorned goddess. And yet, after the chaos, she composed herself, sent up the next course flawlessly, and received polite applause that never reached her ears. When the final dish was served and the dining room erupted in genteel praise, the cook rarely heard it. She was already spoiled, grabbed down the battlefield, sleeves rolled, face flushed, muttering about the idiots upstairs who think salmon poaches itself. Exhausted, uncelebrated, and smelling faintly of onions, she'd collapse into her small attic room, the silent hero of an evening that everyone else believed had gone smoothly. Still, in that exhaustion lay a quiet pride. For many cooks, perfection wasn't about applause, it was about mastery. In a world where class defined every breath, a well-made meal was one small rebellion against invisibility. The cook might not be welcome at the table, but her work ruled it. Victorian kitchens were infernos of discipline, chaos, and occasional genius. The dining room glittered with illusion, but below stairs, sweat and skill built that illusion one frantic dish at a time. And when the night ended, with guests drunk on claret and self-importance, it was the cook who held the real story of the evening, scalded, exhausted, and absolutely essential. The only thing more unstable than a souffle was the cook's mental state. No part of a Victorian dinner inspired more quiet panic, or louder bragging, than the wine. For the host, it was both the crown jewel of the evening and the ticking time bomb beneath the table. It didn't matter how perfect the soup was or how mathematically aligned the forks sat. One wrong bottle of claret could destroy an entire reputation. Wine wasn't just a drink in Victorian Britain. It was a social ranking system poured into a glass. You didn't drink to enjoy it. You drank to prove you could afford the headache. To understand this obsession, you have to remember that wine in Victorian England wasn't about pleasure. It was about pedigree. What you poured reflected not your palate, but your position in society. French wines, particularly claret and champagne, reigned supreme. A good Bordeaux could elevate your dinner to aristocratic heights. A mediocre one could make your family look hopelessly provincial. Sherry, port, and Madeira were also staples, sweet, rich, and heavy. Perfect for keeping conversation flowing long after reason had left the room. But these drinks didn't come cheap. Importing wine was an elaborate, expensive ritual that began long before the first cork was popped. Bottles had to be shipped across the channel, often through unpredictable weather and even more unpredictable tariffs. Customs officers inspected crates as if searching for contraband, and sometimes they were right. Desperate merchants occasionally watered down their stock or faked labels to pass off cheap blends as the real thing. The Victorian upper class, of course, pretended not to notice as long as the bottle said Bordeaux and the price tag caused mild chest pain. The wealthy collected wine the way modern collectors hoard art, not to use but to display. Cellars were more than storage. They were monuments to overconfidence. A respectable host was expected to possess a small but impressive collection, ideally with a few dusty bottles older than any living relative. Guests might never see the cellar, but they'd hear about it. The butler would drop the name of a vintage like a royal title. The 1846 claret, sir. Excellent year. Whether it was an excellent year was irrelevant. The phrase alone was worth the investment. For the middle classes, this expectation was a curse. Having a wine cellar implied both wealth and refinement, but building one required both too. Many suburban homes didn't even have basements deep enough for proper storage, leading to tragic improvisations like wine cupboards, or worse, under-the-stairs cellars, which mostly produced bottles tasting faintly of coal and damp wallpaper. Still, the illusion mattered more than the taste. Victorians lived in a world where even their beverages had to be socially certified. Serving wine was a delicate art in itself. The order mattered. The glasses mattered. The temperature mattered. Guests didn't simply drink, they performed. Dinner began with sherry or Madeira to stimulate the appetite, followed by white wine with fish, red wine with the roast, and champagne with dessert. Port arrived with the cheese course, heavy and sweet enough to knock out knocks. Water, meanwhile, was viewed with suspicion. Only the poor drank it unadulterated. Each bottle had its role in the evening's theatre. Champagne was the crowd pleaser, the sparkle of luxury that every hostess dreamed of serving. But real champagne was ruinously expensive, imported from France and taxed heavily. The middle class often bought British imitations, carbonated concoctions that popped like the real thing, but tasted like regret. Guests smiled politely while sipping, pretending it was dry instead of questionable. It was the social contract of the age. Never acknowledge disappointment, especially when it's fizzing in your glass. Then came claret, the aristocratic favourite. A deep red Bordeaux that signalled good breeding and even better connections. To serve claret was to whisper, "We know things about France that you don't." But it had to be the right claret. Choose a poor vintage and you might as well serve vinegar. Choose one too expensive and you risked whispers about overreaching ambition. It was the liquid embodiment of class anxiety. You couldn't win, only balance precariously between taste and financial ruin. Port, by contrast, was the gentleman's drink. It anchored the post-dinner ritual when the ladies withdrew to the drawing room and the men remained behind, pretending to discuss politics while slowly losing motor function. Port was heavy, potent and symbolic. To refuse it was unmanly, to overindulge was unrefined. The ideal drinker swirled it thoughtfully, quoted a newspaper opinion, and hoped no one noticed the sudden red flush of intoxication. Even the act of serving wine was a test of refinement. The butler, that stoic arbiter of grace, had to pour without dripping, always from the right-hand side, always with the label facing the guest. If the wine was decanted, it had to be done hours earlier through muslin to remove sediment, a ritual so elaborate it bordered on spiritual purification. Guests, meanwhile, had to pretend to appreciate the aroma without revealing they had no idea what they were smelling. A nod and a murmured "quite robust" usually did the trick, but the pressure didn't stop there. Choosing wine also required knowledge of vintages, regions and trends, the 19th century equivalent of mastering fine art or opera. Manuals were written to instruct aspiring hosts on proper taste, full of advice like, never serve champagne with fish unless you wish to appear gauche. The result was a nation of nervous drinkers terrified of serving the wrong bottle. Of course, the irony was that most Victorians didn't even like wine that much. It was an acquired taste, and one few had genuinely acquired. Many found claret too dry, champagne too sharp, and port too syrupy. But liking it wasn't the point. Owning it was. To refuse wine on the grounds of preference was to risk social exile. The only acceptable reason to decline was doctor's orders, and even then guests would exchange sympathetic looks as if mourning your moral decline. By the end of the evening, the host was broke, the guests were half sloshed, and the butler was silently cursing the sticky residue on every glass. The bottles stood empty, the labels admired, the headaches imminent. But reputation had been preserved, and in Victorian society that was worth any hangover. You didn't drink to enjoy it, you drank to prove you could afford the headache. While the kitchen boiled, the butler decanted, and the dining room glowed like a cathedral of anxiety, another battlefield was being prepared upstairs, the dressing room. Because if the food was the bait and the wine the baited hook, then fashion was the glittering lure that made the entire performance irresistible. A Victorian dinner party wasn't just about eating, it was about being seen eating, while looking ruinously magnificent. The clothes were the costume, the body to the stage, and the price tag the punchline. Victorian fashion didn't flatter you, it financially flattened you. The evening attire for a dinner party was nothing short of a moral declaration. One did not simply get dressed. One emerged from a chrysalis of fabric, whalebone, and obligation. For the hostess, this meant an evening gown so heavy it could double as personal armour. Silk, satin, tulle, lace. Every inch had to shimmer, drape, and whisper. Expensive. The colours followed strict social codes, darker shades for older women, pastels for debutantes, and black only for widows or women who wanted to make others slightly uncomfortable. And heaven forbid a lady wore the same gown twice in a season. The social calendar was a sartorial death trap, demanding constant reinvention. Dressmakers, or more accurately debt makers, thrived on this obsession. A single gown could cost the equivalent of a servant's annual wage. Yet women commissioned them relentlessly because showing restraint in fashion was almost as scandalous as showing ankles. One etiquette writer declared, "A lady must never be memorable for economy." Translation: financial prudence is for the poor. The accessories were their own economy. Gloves, for instance, were non-negotiable. No respectable woman exposed her bare hands at dinner, lest she was eating or committing social suicide. Gloves came in shades of ivory and cream, and ideally matched the complexion one pretended to have naturally. The most fashionable were made from kid leather so fine that they tore if you breathed too confidently near them. Women often bought them a size too small to ensure a perfect fit, a ritual that required talcum powder, prayer, and occasionally a second person for assistance. Jewellery was another act of warfare. Diamonds, pearls, cameos, the more the better. Each gem was both a decoration and a declaration. A well-chosen necklace could say, "I am elegant," but a poorly chosen one could scream, "Inherited from someone less refined." Many families displayed their wealth through heirloom pieces, even when those jewels were the only thing of value left in the house. Pawnshops across London thrived on post-dinner deposits, glittering reminders that appearances always came first. Hairstyles, too, were high-stakes architecture. Women's hair was twisted, braided, and pinned into elaborate constructions that defied both logic and gravity. It wasn't uncommon for a lady to spend hours sitting still while a maid wrestled with combs, ribbons, and an alarming amount of hair oil. The goal was to look effortlessly graceful, like a Greek statue who'd just been introduced to hairspray. Unfortunately, this grace came at the price of neck cramps and the occasional fire hazard from nearby candles. Men, though spared the corsets and crinolines, suffered their own brand of misery. Evening dress for gentlemen was a rigid formula. Black tailcoat, white waistcoat, starched shirt, and bow tie tight enough to induce mild asphyxiation. The goal was uniformity, but not an anonymity. The subtle differences, the sheen of a lapel, the sharpness of a crease, told other men exactly where you stood in the social food chain. The more your clothes looked uncomfortable, the more respectable you appeared. Collars were the worst offenders. The infamous choker collar, starched and razor-sharp, could slice into the skin if worn too tightly, which, of course, it always was. Gentlemen endured this willingly, believing that looking distinguished was worth the loss of peripheral circulation. Some even fainted during dinner, blamed it on the heat, and called it fashionable. The host and hostess bore the greatest burden. Their outfits weren't mere clothes, they were symbols of the household's entire reputation. The hostess's gown had to outshine every guest's without appearing to try too hard, a delicate dance between brilliance and modesty. Her husband's attire needed to signal both wealth and stability, even if he was currently mortgaging his breakfast table. Together they stood at the entrance like living exhibits, smiling through the collective agony of lace, starch and looming insolvency. And the servants noticed everything. The lady's maid whispered about worn hems, the butler judged the cut of the master's coat, and the footman silently wagered whether the jewels were genuine or rented. Because yes, jewellery rental existed. Entire businesses offered diamonds and tiaras for the evening, ensuring that even the socially desperate could sparkle temporarily before returning to economic darkness. Few guests admitted it, but many glittered on borrowed time. For the middle classes, dressing the part was a high-wire act. Too plain and you risked appearing unworthy. Too opulent and you risked accusations of pretension. Families resorted to creative recycling, remaking old gowns with new trimmings, turning faded silk inside out, or borrowing accessories from more fortunate relatives. But no matter how inventive the tailoring, everyone lived in fear of that one eagle-eyed guest who would murmur, "Ah, Mrs. Pemberton, I see you've reimagined last year's bodice." That single comment could undo months of careful deception. Men fared little better. Tailcoats had to be cut by reputable London tailors, never provincial ones, and shoes polished until they reflected your despair. Many resorted to wearing the same formal suit for years, quietly updating the waistcoat to keep up appearances. Others went into debt for a proper tailor-made ensemble, reasoning that bankruptcy in good silk was preferable to solvency in cheap wool. When the clock struck 8 and guests descended into the dining room, the real feast was visual. Candlelight glinted off jewels, silk shimmered like liquid wealth, and lace trembled with every nervous movement. The air was thick with perfume and tension. Every step, every bow, every flick of a fan was part of the grand illusion that everyone here was effortlessly fashionable, financially stable, and not secretly wondering whether they could afford breakfast tomorrow. Victorian fashion didn't flatter you, it financially flattened you. If you were lucky enough to be invited to a grand Victorian dinner, your first impression wouldn't be the food, the guests, or even the mountain of silverware. It would be the light. The moment you stepped through the door, you'd be bathed in a golden glow so lavish, so brilliant, that you'd swear you'd wandered into a chandelier's fever dream. The flicker of candles on glass, the gleam of firelight on mahogany, the sparkle of gas lamps dancing over polished silver. It was dazzling and ruinously expensive. The house glowed so brightly you could almost see your savings evaporating. Victorians treated illumination as both art and warfare. A brightly lit home was a social triumph, a declaration that you had not only money, but the confidence to burn it. Darkness, on the other hand, was associated with poverty, shame, or worse. Bad wallpaper. Guests expected light that flattered their faces and hid imperfections. And the only thing more humiliating than a dull dinner conversation was a dimly lit one. So hosts went to absurd lengths to ensure their rooms shimmered like palaces, even if their bank accounts looked more like Dickensian cautionary tales. Before the age of electricity, this meant one thing above all: candles. Lots of candles, hundreds of them, thousands if you were truly ambitious or deeply unwise. Beeswax candles were the gold standard, bright, slow burning and outrageously priced. Each one was hand-rolled, perfumed faintly of honey, and cost more than a decent loaf of bread. Cheaper alternatives made from tallow were available, but they smoked, dripped, and smelled faintly of barnyard tragedy. A respectable household would sooner host a séance than light tallow candles for guests. Imagine the logistics. Every chandelier, wall sconce and candelabrum filled with dozens of candles, each needing to be lit individually by servants carrying long tapers. Lighting the dining room could take an hour, extinguishing it another. The butler oversaw the process with the solemnity of a high priest. There was a proper order to everything. Chandeliers first, wall sconces next, table candles last. Heaven help the servant who lit them unevenly. A single candle shorter than the rest wasn't a minor detail. It was an aesthetic crime, and those candles burned fast. A grand dinner might consume a small forest in beeswax by the end of the night. Hosts sometimes bought them by the crate, stashing extras in the cellar like hoarded treasure. After all, nothing screamed success like your chandelier burning bright enough to tan your guests. Yet beneath all that golden glow, the host couldn't help but calculate how many hours of candlelight equaled a month's rent. The answer was usually too many. If the candles didn't bankrupt you, the heating probably would. The Victorian dinner party season coincided with the colder months, because it's easier to flaunt wealth when guests can't escape outdoors, so warmth was mandatory. Coal fires were the centerpiece of comfort and display. A roaring hearth signalled prosperity. A weak one signalled penny pinching. The coal that fueled those flames was expensive, especially the good kind. Anthracite that burned clean and bright, not the cheap smoky stuff that made your curtains weep soot. Every important room needed a fire. The drawing room, the dining room, the hallway, even the spare lavatory if you truly wanted to show off. The scullery maids started tending those fires hours before the guests arrived, feeding the grates like mechanical dragons. Buckets of coal disappeared by the minute, and the temperature downstairs in the kitchen rose to mild inferno. Upstairs, guests fanned themselves politely and remarked on how delightfully cosy it was, unaware that the warmth had cost more than the cheese course. By the 1850s, gas lighting had begun to appear in wealthier homes, and with it came a new kind of bragging right, technological sophistication. Having your home wired for gas was a marvel of modern progress, a sign that you had both money and a mild disregard for personal safety. Gas lamps cast a whiter, steadier light than candles, but they hissed, leaked, and occasionally exploded. Yet for many Victorians, the risk of turning the dining room into a controlled detonation was preferable to looking behind the times. The more daring hosts even mixed light sources, a chandelier of beeswax candles here, a row of gas sconces there, creating a spectacle that dazzled the eyes and terrified the servants. Of course, gas wasn't cheap either. London gas companies charged by the cubic foot, and they knew desperation when they saw it. Social climbers would literally outshine each other, leaving their lamps burning long after guests had gone, just so passers-by would see the glow and whisper, "My, they must be doing well." Meanwhile, the morning's gas bill could make even the bravest butler blanch. There were cases of hosts discreetly dimming their lamps mid-dinner, blaming drafts while quietly saving shillings per minute. The servants bore the worst of it. After the guests left, they'd extinguish the fires, snuff out hundreds of candles, and scrape wax off every conceivable surface. The dining room would smell faintly of smoke, wax, and the host's poor decisions. The next morning the butler tallied the candle stubs like evidence of a crime scene, while the master of the house sat at the breakfast table, staring into his lukewarm tea, wondering if illumination had been worth the financial darkness to come, and yet it always was, or so they told themselves, because in the grand theatre of Victorian society, light was everything. It made people beautiful, homes magnificent, and debt look like dignity. The warm glow of candlelight hid the cracks in plaster and the tremors in one's hands. Coal fires crackled with illusion. Gas lamps hummed with ambition. And for one glorious evening, the house truly looked wealthy, even if the ledger said otherwise. When dawn finally crept through the soot-streaked curtains, the rooms looked dull and cold again. The magic had gone, leaving only ash, wax, and a faint scent of financial ruin. But the memory lingered, for the hosts, for the guests, and for the poor servants who'd be cleaning it all again next week. The house glowed so brightly you could almost see your savings evaporating. By the time the candles were lit and the wine decanted, every inch of a Victorian home had to scream stability, refinement, and permanence, even if most of it had been hauled in by strangers that very morning. Because beneath the satin tablecloth and polite laughter lay one of the great unspoken truths of Victorian society. Most of what gleamed inside those homes didn't actually belong to the people who lived there. Welcome to the secret economy of borrowed grandeur, the world of rented furniture, loaned silverware, and decorative deceit. That mahogany sideboard, it had more owners than the British monarchy. Victorian hospitality was built on illusion, and nowhere was that illusion thicker than in the drawing rooms and dining halls of the aspirational middle class. A home wasn't just a shelter, it was a statement, a three-dimensional resume declaring that you were trustworthy, tasteful, and absolutely solvent, even if the furniture payment suggested otherwise. The appearance of wealth mattered infinitely more than its reality. Guests didn't need to know that your elegant walnut chairs came from a rental service that charged by the fortnight. They just needed to admire how beautifully they matched your family portraits, which were often as new as the upholstery. Furniture rental was not just common, it was an industry. London, Manchester, and other major cities were filled with showrooms advertising temporary elegance for permanent impressions. For a modest monthly fee, one could rent entire room sets, gilt-edged mirrors, velvet drapes, marble-topped sideboards, and enough mahogany to suggest ancestral ties to a minor lord. It was the era's most genteel con, pay to look rich until someone richer invites you over and spots their own rented chair. The most desperate even rented silverware. Etiquette demanded that a dinner table gleam with polished metal, but genuine sterling cost a fortune. So companies emerged to meet the need, delivering crates of borrowed cutlery and decorative serving trays to households preparing for important company. Some firms even provided servants trained to handle the borrowed silver discreetly, ensuring no one noticed that the family crest had been hastily replaced with a blank space. For one glorious evening, the illusion of old money gleamed brighter than the candles, and then, at dawn, it all went back into crates, leaving behind only debts and crumbs. But it didn't stop there. Victorians also borrowed art. Paintings were the silent judges of taste, so bare walls were unacceptable. For those lacking inherited landscapes or portraiture of brooding ancestors, galleries offered seasonal rentals. A family could borrow oil paintings for a few weeks to impress guests, choosing from catalogues that ranged from pastoral scenes, respectable leisure, to Roman ruins, worldly education. Some households changed their borrowed art as often as their menu, swapping rural tranquility for Venetian romance depending on the guest list. It was a performance of sophistication so committed that even the wallpaper blushed with second-hand pride. For the socially ambitious, borrowing furniture was almost a survival strategy. The rising middle classes were trapped between worlds, too wealthy to live plainly, too fragile to live authentically. They wanted to project inherited confidence, but inheritance had inconveniently failed to arrive. Renting a piano, for example, was essential. Even if no one in the household could play it, the sight of it implied culture, education, and a hint of melancholy genius. A home without a piano, declared one etiquette guide, is a soul without refinement. The fact that most of those pianos returned to warehouses after the season ended didn't seem to bother anyone. Servants were often in on the secret. They arrived with the rented furniture, set it up, and then vanished before the guests came. The household's permanent staff were sworn to slants under threat of dismissal about which items were truly owned. This created bizarre moments during parties where the hostess would gush, "Oh yes, that sideboard has been in the family for generations," while the maid silently prayed that no one leaned on it too hard, lest the rental tag still tied underneath fall onto the carpet. Even flowers weren't safe from deception. Florists catered to dinner hosts who couldn't afford fresh arrangements daily, offering permanent displays, wax flowers that could be polished between dinners. They looked deceptively real by candlelight, though occasionally melted during summer soirees, creating the distinct aroma of desperation and beeswax. The upper classes, of course, found the whole thing amusing, until they did it themselves. Even aristocrats occasionally rented furniture when hosting in their city homes, unwilling to transport heirlooms back and forth from their country estates. Some, embarrassed by financial decline, quietly pawned genuine antiques and replaced them with rented replicas. The difference between a struggling aristocrat and an ambitious merchant was, at times, only the polish on the veneer. The culture of borrowed grandeur bred an entire etiquette of make-believe. Guests pretended not to notice that the same silver punch bowl had appeared at 3 dinners in the same district. Hosts avoided sitting near the rented piano lest anyone request a song. Everyone smiled, nodded, and agreed that taste was eternal, even if the invoice said, "Return by Monday." For the truly daring, borrowing wasn't enough. Imitation became the next step. Craftsmen specialising in faux finishes could transform pine into mahogany with strategic layers of stain and varnish. Plaster could pass for marble under low lighting, and papier-mâché masqueraded as carved wood. Whole rooms were built to deceive the human eye, dazzling in dim candlelight but betraying themselves by morning. Victorian interiors were works of art and artifice. The irony was that the illusion often worked too well. Some guests were so impressed they commissioned identical pieces, accidentally renting the same furniture from the same shop. Entire social circles ended up dining on interchangeable chairs, raising glasses beside the same imitation marble busts, all congratulating each other on their unique taste. It was a grand farce, a culture of showmanship where wealth was less a possession than a performance. By the end of the night, the servants disassembled the dream. The piano was lifted out, the silver packed, the chairs stacked carefully on carts that rattled into the foggy London dawn. The house fell silent, stripped back to its modest bones. But for a few brief hours the illusion had worked. The family had seemed grand, elegant, and timeless. The guests would leave believing they had dined among the refined, and the hosts would count that as victory enough to justify next month's debt. That mahogany sideboard? It had more owners than the British monarchy. If the Victorian dinner table gleamed like a battlefield, etiquette was the invisible assassin stalking everyone seated around it. The chandeliers sparkled, the cutlery glistened, and the roast was perfectly cooked. But one misplaced napkin, one wrong word, one fork held at the wrong angle, and your social life could end before dessert. The Victorians turned dining into a blood sport where the weapons were manners, and survival depended on knowing an impossible list of rules no one would ever fully explain. One wrong fork angle, and your reputation died before dessert. Victorian etiquette was a form of social engineering, an intricate system designed to separate the civilized from the suspect. It wasn't enough to have money or fine clothes. One had to behave properly, and properly change depending on who you were sitting next to. Every moment at dinner was a test: how you entered the room, how you sat, how you breathed. A misstep wasn't simply embarrassing, it was moral failure disguised as clumsiness. The rulebook of dining decorum wasn't written in ink, it was carved into social survival. The first trap came before anyone even touched the table. When entering the dining room, guests had to follow a strict pecking order. The host escorted the most distinguished lady, while the hostess took the most important gentleman. Everyone else paired up by descending rank like a human train of hierarchy. Heaven help you if you misjudged your place and walked ahead of someone more titled, and that was like cutting in line at church. Those few steps from drawing room to dining table were a parade of judgment. Every whisper of silk and every polished shoe step declared your awareness, or lack thereof, of your social standing. Once seated, the performance intensified. The seating arrangement itself was a coded diagram of importance. The closer you sat to the host or hostess, the higher your social value. Farther down the table meant you were either dull, scandalous, or both. And no, you couldn't rearrange your seat to improve your prospects, not unless you wanted to start a miniature scandal. Etiquette manuals advised, never seem eager to converse with the host unless addressed first. Translation, stay in your lane, eat your soup, and pray no one notices your existence. Then came the silverware gauntlet. Every guest faced a small arsenal of utensils arranged like a puzzle designed by a sadist. The rule was simple, work from the outside in, but panic could still strike. Was that small fork for oysters or salad? Was the spoon for soup or pudding? Was it gauche to ask? Yes, always yes. A single hesitation could expose you as socially untrained, the Victorian equivalent of shouting, "I'm middle class," across the gizl. The proper grip of a fork alone was a lifelong education, prongs down, handle delicately balanced, wrist unmoving, expression serene. Eat too quickly, you were vulgar. Eat too slowly, you were pretentious. And then came conversation, the deadliest course of all. Talking at dinner was mandatory, but what you said could ruin you faster than spoiled milk. The host usually began by addressing the guest of honour, setting the tone for the evening's dialogue. Everyone else was expected to exchange polite nothings about weather, travel, and the agreeable season. Controversial topics, politics, religion, money, illness, and anything French that wasn't food were strictly forbidden. Even compliments had rules. Praising the food was acceptable. Praising the cook was not. That was servant familiarity. Laughter had to be measured. A restrained smile was elegant. An audible chuckle was dangerous. Full-bodied laughter could end your marriage prospects. Sneezing required delicate apology. Blowing your nose was an act of courage. And under no circumstances were bodily noises permitted, though given the typical Victorian diet of rich meats, gravies, and starch, nature often had other plans. Those who failed to suppress themselves entirely simply coughed and blamed the dust. Even how you ate your soup was a moral test. One did not slurp, blow, or, God forbid, scrape at the spoon. Soup was to be consumed sadly by tilting the bowl away from you, not toward. This simple rule was so counterintuitive that countless manuals felt compelled to include diagrams, as though British society depended on the angle of one's broth. Bread had to be torn, not bitten, cheese cut, not stabbed, and under no circumstance was the knife allowed to touch your lips, lest you be mistaken for an uneducated rustic or worse, American. Serving etiquette was its own labyrinth. Food was passed to the right, wine to the left, unless the butler intervened, which he always did. Guests were never to reach point or ask directly for anything. You had to imply hunger, not announce it. A well-bred person was expected to starve gracefully rather than request potatoes too audibly. The host's role was to anticipate every need, which meant the poor man spent half the meal conducting silent telepathy across the table. Even gestures were policed. Elbows off the table, hands visible but never animated. Napkin unfolded once, placed in the lap, never tucked in or waved around like a flag of distress. The posture rule was ironclad. Sit straight, lean slightly forward, and never rest your wrists on the table. Victorians believed posture reflected inner virtue. Slouching was a sign of weak morals and possibly weak character. To survive dinner, one had to dine like a statue brought temporarily to life. The most treacherous rule, however, came at the end. When dinner was finished, no one could leave their seat until the hostess gave the signal. Standing early was an act of social defiance, an unspoken, "I've had enough." Instead, guests waited in tense stillness until the hostess nodded, a tiny gesture that might as well have been divine permission. Then, like a flock of obedient birds, everyone rose simultaneously, smiling as if they hadn't been mentally begging for freedom since the fish course. All of it, the cutlery ballet, the conversational tightrope, the posture gymnastics, served a purpose. It wasn't about manners, it was about control. Etiquette was the invisible cage that kept society in order. Every rule reinforced hierarchy, every gesture reminded guests where they stood. And the cruel genius of it all was that the rules were always shifting. Just when you thought you'd mastered the proper way to butter bread, someone decided that buttering at the table was vulgar. The game never ended. As the evening wore on and dessert finally arrived, guests could breathe again. Carefully, of course, through the nose. They smiled, exchanged compliments, and pretended they hadn't spent the last 2 hours terrified of holding the wrong spoon. The Victorians believed dinner was a reflection of civilization itself, but to anyone living through it, it probably felt more like a hostage situation with better tableware. One wrong fork angle and your reputation died before dessert. Once the soup had been sipped without scandal and the forks had been brandished in proper sequence, it was time for the most terrifying course of all, conversation. Because in Victorian society, words were every bit as dangerous as knives, and far sharper when misused. The dinner table might look serene, a landscape of lace and civility, but beneath that glittering surface lay a minefield of unspoken rules and conversational traps. Every phrase, every laugh, every silence was loaded with consequence. Say too little, you're dull. Say too much, you're French. The art of conversation at a Victorian dinner party was a delicate high-wire act suspended between wit and disaster. You had to be clever, but never cleverer than your betters, flattering but not fawning, and charming without ever hinting that you had an actual personality. For men, conversation was an opportunity to display cultivated intellect, provided it didn't wander into opinion, which was vulgar. For women, it was a chance to appear refined and amiably bright, though not too bright, lest they alarm the menfolk. Every syllable had to be polished, weighed, and deployed like a social weapon wrapped in velvet. Etiquette manuals of the era read like psychological survival guides. They instructed guests on precisely what to say and, more importantly, what not to. Politics? Too divisive. Religion? Too risky. Money? Positively obscene. Illness? Never. The Victorians were already one autopsy away from hysteria. Even discussing the weather was tricky, as excessive enthusiasm about sunshine could be mistaken for vulgar optimism. Instead, the ideal dinner conversation consisted of what one writer called light elegance. Topics so harmless they could not possibly offend: art, travel, gardens, literature, but never the controversial parts, and vague references to society events everyone pretended to have attended. The table was divided into conversational zones, each governed by invisible boundaries. Guests were expected to direct their chatter primarily toward the person seated beside them, a rule that produced an endless ballet of angled necks and forced smiles. Speaking across the table was forbidden. It disrupted symmetry. The hostess's job was to orchestrate this verbal choreography. She was expected to glide gracefully from one polite cluster of dialogue to another, sprinkling charm like powdered sugar. If a lull in conversation occurred, it reflected poorly on her hospitality, not on the guests. For the gentleman, the opening line was everything. "Have you read the latest Mr. Dickens?" was usually a safe bet. Even if you hadn't, you could murmur something vague about his mastery of character. For ladies, complimenting another's gown or jewellery was an equally reliable entry point. The conversation would then flow through a pre-approved series of steps: mild observation, gentle laughter, modest self-deprecation, and finally silence, the golden punctuation of Victorian civility. The great danger, of course, was humour. Wit was encouraged in theory but punished in practice. A clever remark could win admiration. But one word too many and you risked appearing unladylike or unsteady. The upper classes adored witty people, as long as the wit was directed elsewhere. There was an unwritten rule: you could joke about the French, the weather, or the misfortunes of people poorer than everyone present. Anything else was a gamble. A joke that didn't land could hang in the air like a dying fly. Worse, it could be misinterpreted. One careless quip about the quality of the roast might be read as an insult to the hostess's lineage. Silence, too, was dangerous. Remaining quiet could be mistaken for dullness, melancholy, or, heaven forbid, low breeding. perfect conversationalist maintained an unbroken rhythm of engagement, never too eager, never too aloof. Victorians didn't talk to learn, they talked to maintain equilibrium. Conversation wasn't communication, it was choreography. Then there were the conversational predators, those seasoned social climbers who wielded small talk like a rapier. They could turn a question as simple as, "Have you been to Brighton?" into a status trap. Answer no, and you revealed your provinciality. Answer yes, and you might be accused of showing off. The truly skilled guest deflected gracefully. "I have not been recently, though I hear the promenade remains delightful." Translation: I'm sophisticated, but not arrogant enough to prove it. The Victorians even developed their own dialect of conversational euphemism. Quite interesting meant utterly dreadful. How curious meant I'm judging you, and indeed, delivered with the right inflection, could end a man's social ambitions. A simple phrase could carry an arsenal of meanings, all determined by tone, eyebrow height, and the angle of one's teacup. Flattery was the lubrication that kept the whole machinery turning. Complimenting the hostess's decor was essential, though never too specifically, lest you realise you were analysing it. Praise for the food was permitted, but had to be restrained. Excessive enthusiasm made you look gluttonous. The goal was to project what Victorians called agreeable intelligence, the ability to converse pleasantly about everything without ever saying anything at all. Foreign guests, especially the French, often found these rituals absurd. The French valued spirited debate. The British valued not spilling their wine while pretending to have one. A Parisian dinner might end in laughter and passionate argument. A London one ended in mild smiles and everyone congratulating each other on how pleasantly unremarkable the evening had been. To speak too freely, too passionately, too honestly was the social equivalent of streaking through Hyde Park. Say too little, you're dull. Say too much, you're French. As the meal progressed, conversation followed a predictable rhythm. Early courses called for polite small talk, the main course for mild wit, and dessert for gentle fatigue disguised as charm. By the time coffee arrived, guests were running on fumes, their smiles stiff, their jokes rehearsed. The women soon excused themselves to the drawing room, a genteel retreat from the battlefield, while the men lingered, free at last to loosen their tongues over port and politics. It's easy to laugh at such elaborate restraint now, but for the Victorians, it was deadly serious. Conversation wasn't just talk, it was performance art. It separated the refined from the reckless, the cultured from the clumsy. A well-spoken guest could climb the social ladder one compliment at a time. A poorly timed remark could send them tumbling back into obscurity. When the final good evening was said and the last carriage clattered away, everyone left believing they'd spoken just the right amount, not realising that everyone else had been hurriedly dissecting their every word. It was exhausting, absurd, and oddly beautiful in its precision. A society so afraid of saying the wrong thing that it built an entire language of nothing at all. Say too little, you're dull. Say too much, you're French. By the time the candles flickered over the immaculate table and the orchestra of silverware began its gentle clinking, one thing became clear. This wasn't dinner. It was theatre. In the Victorian world, eating wasn't about hunger, it was about display. The table was the stage, the guests the actors, and the host and hostess the overworked directors praying no one dropped a spoon or fainted from tight lacing before the curtain call. Victorian dinners weren't meals. They were 3-hour endurance tests in corsets. To the untrained eye, it all looked effortless. The smooth passing of plates, the delicate gestures, the quiet murmur of conversation, perfection. But beneath that polished surface was panic. Every motion was a performance. A fork wasn't just a fork, it was a moral statement. The way you held it, the speed at which you raised it, and the exact tilt of your wrist all revealed your breeding. Eating too fast suggested vulgar appetite. Eating too slowly suggested pretense. You were expected to eat just quickly enough to demonstrate refinement but not hunger, a delicate balance between starvation and grace. Posture was paramount. Guests sat bolt upright, shoulders back, elbows tight to their sides, as though the ghost of Queen Victoria herself were measuring the angle of their spines. Slouching wasn't merely lazy, it was sinful. A rigid back implied discipline, self-control and moral purity, all of which were apparently visible in the way one speared a piece of mutton. The corset, that medieval instrument of both fashion and torture, made this easier and harder at once. Easier to maintain posture, harder to breathe. Some women grew so lightheaded from the combination of hunger and compression that they had to feign faintness just to stand up for air. Eating, in short, was an athletic event disguised as elegance. The proper sequence of motions resembled choreography. Knife in the right hand, fork in the left, cut neatly, then switch hands before lifting to the mouth, but never directly. Food had to be transported gracefully, no stabbing, scooping or shoveling. Biting into food was out of the question. Everything was to be divided into dainty, chewable fragments. Even peas, those tiny green agents of chaos, required delicate manoeuvring. Dropping one was a minor tragedy. Chasing it around the plate with a fork was unthinkable. The true professional mastered the mash and lift technique, flattening the peas into submission before collecting them discreetly, all while maintaining polite conversation about the weather. The eyes too had to perform. One never looked down at one's plate for too long. That suggested greed. Instead, diners alternated between brief glances at their food and polite eye contact with their neighbours, as if silently reassuring everyone that they weren't enjoying themselves too much. Facial expressions were crucial. Pleasure had to be muted. A content smile was acceptable. An audible sigh of satisfaction could get you socially executed. Even chewing had its etiquette. It had to be cheelant, rhythmic, and invisible. Lips closed at all times. The sound of mastication was the death rattle of respectability. And while it was technically permissible to sip wine between bites, one had to do so with an air of restraint, as though reluctantly partaking in luxury. A gulp was barbaric, a sip refined, and heaven forbid anyone drank before the host gave the signal. That was the conversational equivalent of declaring war. The most delicate act of all was navigating food you didn't like. Victorian menus, while impressive, were also culinary minefields. Jellied meats, overboiled vegetables, and sauces thick enough to stop clocks were all staples of high society. But no guest dared show distaste. If the soup was cold or the roast overcooked, polite society demanded denial. You smiled, swallowed, and hoped your face didn't betray your internal rebellion. One guidebook put it bluntly: to display dislike of a dish is to cast insult upon your host's honour. And so, across Britain, guests quietly suffered in the name of civility, martyrs to manners and underseasoned cuisine. Then there was the spectacle of service. Food didn't simply appear, it was presented. Each dish was paraded by servants as if on a royal procession. Guests watched the spectacle with admiration, knowing full well they'd barely touch half of it. The act of refusing seconds was as important as eating the first portion. A firm no thank you delivered with the right tone conveyed refinement. A third helping suggested moral decay. Even the act of pausing between bites carried meaning. A fork and knife placed parallel on the plate meant finished. Crossed utensils meant not yet. And placing your fork incorrectly could trigger chaos, servants hovering ready to whisk away your half-eaten trout under the tragic assumption that you were done. Guests learned to keep one eye on their plate and another on the butler's movements, lest a premature fork placement lead to starvation. The pressure was relentless, especially for women. They were expected to eat delicately, speak charmingly, and consume roughly half as much as men. Overindulgence was unbecoming, while abstaining entirely risked appearing faint or ill. The sweet spot was to appear gently satisfied, glowing with restraint. As one etiquette expert put it, ladies' appetite should be as modest as her laughter. No one mentioned that both were stifled by the same corset. For men, the challenge was different, but no less absurd. They had to carve meat with precision, pour wine without spilling, and appear simultaneously gracious and dominant. A man who dropped a piece of cutlery might as well resign from public life. Worse, a man who failed to assist a lady in distress, say a pea rolling toward the edge of her plate, risked being deemed unchivalrous. Dinner wasn't about sustenance. It was about the constant maintenance of reputation. By the end of the evening, the guests were exhausted, shoulders aching, stomachs compressed, cheeks stiff from polite smiling. The host raised a final toast and everyone exhaled silently, like prisoners being told the war was over. The plates were cleared, the candles burned low, and the performers of polite society retreated, victorious but hungry. In theory, the dinner had been a triumph of elegance and control. In reality, it was a perfectly choreographed endurance trial where nobody truly ate, nobody truly relaxed, and everyone left with a deep respect for the human capacity to suffer gracefully. Victorian dinners weren't meals, they were 3-hour endurance tests in corsets. The dinner plates were cleared, the final toast had been made, and the guests, now buzzing gently from sherry and suppressed emotion, were herded into the drawing room. The meal might be over, but the performance was not. The next act of the evening was about to begin. Post-dinner entertainment, also known as the polite endurance of other people's hobbies. For Victorians, no dinner was complete without a musical interlude, a dramatic reading, or worst of all, a family member convinced they possessed talent. Nothing says elegance like polite applause for auditory suffering. The ritual began the moment the hostess rose from the table. This subtle movement, part ballet, part military signal, sent the women drifting toward the drawing room like a flock of perfumed ghosts. There they would recline gracefully, pretending to be fascinated by the floral arrangements while secretly praying for the men to finish their port quickly. After an interval of suitably masculine conversation and cigar smoke, the gentlemen followed, their entrance marked by a faint aroma of brandy and resignation. Then the torture began. The piano stood at the centre of it all, gleaming in the candlelight like a grand invitation to embarrassment. Every respectable home had one, and every hostess believed it essential to use it. In theory, the post-dinner recital was meant to elevate the evening, a harmonious blend of culture and refinement. In practice, it was a minefield of social tension. Someone would inevitably be persuaded to play, which in Victorian terms meant they had been planning it all week. The chosen performer would feign modesty. "Oh, I couldn't possibly, my fingers are dreadfully out of practice," while inching toward the piano with the eagerness of a stage-starved soprano. The guests, now trapped in a semicircle of forced anticipation, braced themselves. The opening notes rang out, and within seconds, everyone realized the truth. Aunt Mildred could not, in fact, sing. Her rendition of the last rose of summer began tremblingly, like a cat remembering trauma, and grew worse from there. Yet because manners demanded endurance, every guest sat frozen, nodding politely, faces locked in the expression of people who'd been told not to laugh at a funeral. No one dared make eye contact for fear of setting off an uncontrollable fit of giggles. Meanwhile, the hostess, beaming with misplaced pride, mouthed the lyrics silently from across the room as though summoning divine assistance. When the final note finally collapsed into silence, applause erupted, not out of admiration, but relief. Polite society required that every performance, no matter how catastrophic, receive equal applause. To clap too little was cruel. To clap too much was worse. It might encourage an encore. Thus, a delicate balance had to be struck. 3 seconds of applause, one polite bravo, and a rapid transition to refreshments before the performer regained courage. But Aunt Mildred was only the most obvious danger. Music nights could go wrong in countless ways. The family's prize piano might be out of tune, transforming Chopin into chaos. A violinist guest might break a string mid-sonata, forcing an awkward pause while everyone stared determinedly at the wallpaper. Occasionally, a confident amateur would attempt a complex piece and forget the middle entirely, leaving the audience marooned in silence until someone coughed loud enough to justify stopping. These moments of suspended horror were the soul of Victorian social life. And music wasn't the only risk. Poetry readings were equally treacherous. Every dinner seemed to include a gentleman with a penchant for verse, usually one who believed himself to be Byron reborn minus the charm. He would stand by the fire, clear his throat dramatically, and begin reciting his latest composition, To a Lady Seen Beneath the Gaslight. The poem would last 4 stanzas longer than anyone's will to live, and still everyone smiled beatifically, murmuring afterward that it was most moving. Secretly, they hoped never to move again. Some hosts tried to escape musical disaster by substituting parlour games, which only replaced auditory suffering with emotional danger. Charades were popular, though they carried their own risks, chiefly that someone might act out something too enthusiastically and knock over an oil lamp. Other evenings featured recitations of Shakespeare, performed by guests who had never actually read Shakespeare, producing accents that wandered helplessly across 3 continents. The more earnest the performance, the more painful the result. For the guests, navigating this cultural gauntlet required Olympic-level composure. One could not yawn, check the clock, or visibly wince when a high note died mid-air. Instead, Victorians developed the art of the neutral rapture face, a serene half-smile suggesting appreciation without any emotional commitment. It was the facial equivalent of humming agreement while internally screaming. The truly experienced guest even mastered the sympathetic sway, gently rocking to the rhythm in a show of encouragement, all while mentally composing their escape plan. The men fared no better. Once the music ended, conversation resumed with renewed peril. One was expected to comment on the performance, and the language of polite falsehood was highly codified. What a remarkable tone translated to, "I'm astonished the piano survived." Such a heartfelt performance meant it certainly had feelings, and the ultimate social defibrillator, "You play with such confidence," meant precisely what it sounded like: loud, unstoppable, and best left unchallenged. In wealthier homes, some families avoided humiliation by hiring professional musicians to entertain guests instead. But even that had pitfalls. If the performers were too good, the hostess risked being upstaged. If they were too avant-garde, guests might whisper that she was experimenting. Music that was too cheerful seemed lowbrow, too sombre, and everyone went home depressed. Perfection was impossible, but the effort was mandatory. By the end of the evening, nerves were frayed, applause calloused, and the guests, though smiling, were spiritually limp. Still, everyone agreed it had been most delightful, and they meant it in the Victorian sense. They were delighted it was over. The hostess, flushed with relief, would glance around her salon, taking pride in the illusion of harmony she had maintained. The piano lid closed like a coffin, sealing away the night's final note. Post-dinner entertainment wasn't about pleasure. It was about performance, a continuation of the great Victorian lie that refinement was worth any discomfort. The music, good or bad, gave structure to the evening's self-control, proof that everyone present had survived another round of social endurance with their dignity intact. Nothing says elegance like polite applause for auditory suffering. By the time the last wobbly piano note faded and the guests had politely applauded as if their souls depended on it, the evening should, in theory, have begun to relax. But it never did. For now came the most important and terrifying phase of the Victorian dinner party, the judgment hour. The knives might have been cleared from the table, but metaphorically they were only just being unsheathed. Because if there was one thing the Victorians loved more than etiquette, excess, and candlelight, it was gossip. And not idle gossip, mind you. Strategic, tactical, and highly weaponized social espionage. Victorians didn't need the internet, they had dinner parties for that. Every guest, no matter how polite, was a secret inspector. Behind every smile lurked an invisible clipboard. Every compliment was a field note. And every raised eyebrow a subtle review. They came to dine, but they stayed to collect information about fashion, manners, income, rumours, rivalries, and especially who was failing at all of the above. The dinner table was both feast and fact-finding mission, and everyone knew it. The true sport of the evening began not with soup but with silent scrutiny. The reconnaissance started before guests even entered the dining room. As they shed coats and gloves in the hall, their eyes swept the surroundings like trained detectives. Was the carpet too worn? Were the hat stands overcrowded? Did the umbrella rack look, heaven forbid, provincial? Every object was an economic clue, every scent a moral one. A faint whiff of dampness could ruin a family's reputation faster than bankruptcy. A well-placed fern, on the other hand, could suggest virtue, wealth, and tasteful modernity. The moment guests crossed the threshold, the gossip had already begun to germinate. Once seated, the investigations grew more intense. A good Victorian guest could judge a household's entire fortune from the soup alone. If it arrived steaming hot, the servants were well trained. If lukewarm, chaos reigned below stairs. If it contained turtle or lobster, you were dealing with social climbers on a spending spree. A thin broth, meanwhile, whispered of genteel poverty. The temperature of the consommé was practically a credit report. Curtains and upholstery received equal scrutiny. Nothing escaped the eyes of an experienced gossip operative. Heavy damask, a sign of ambition. Chintz, middle-class modesty, or worse, pretense. Guests whispered later about the shade of the drapes, and slightly too bold for true refinement, the height of the floral centerpieces, as if they were hiding the food, and the carpet pile, shorter than expected, poor dear. They must be economizing. Victorians didn't gossip just for amusement. They did it for data. The dinner party was society's news feed, where personal fortunes rose and fell faster than soufflés. Conversation provided another layer of intelligence. Every pause, every stutter, every incorrect use of whom was catalogued. The wrong anecdote could undo a decade of polite reputation building. A man who spoke too much about his business revealed vulgar ambition. A woman who mentioned a new gown too often betrayed financial desperation. Even laughter was analysed, too loud, too quick, too sincere, and your name would be in drawing-room whispers before morning. The most powerful gossip was wordless, born from the glances exchanged across the candlelight, tiny facial tics decoded with surgical precision by people who'd made judgment a full-time career. Of course, the greatest thrill came after the evening ended. Once guests retreated to their carriages, the real conversation began. The moment those wheels rattled away from the curb, every couple launched into the sacred Victorian ritual of the post-dinner debrief. Did you notice the cracks in the teacups? Her lace looked French, but clearly wasn't. And did you see the state of that footman? One glove was shorter than the other. These exchanges were less discussion than dissection. Entire reputations were reduced to verbal confetti before the horses reached the end of the street. The next morning, the information spread through London like wildfire in petticoats. Letters carried gossip across neighbourhoods. Parlour-maid chatter trickled upward through servants' networks faster than telegrams. By midday, half the city could know that Mrs. Pembroke's new sideboard was clearly rented, or that Colonel Fairweather had mispronounced Bordeaux. It was reputation warfare waged with teaspoons and tea. A single misplaced word or mismatched napkin could spark days of delicious scandal. And yet, for all its malice, gossip served a vital social purpose. It kept the hierarchy intact. The Victorians lived in a society obsessed with stability, where everyone needed to know their place, and everyone else's. Gossip was the social currency that kept this rigid world running. It rewarded conformity and punished deviation. It taught the ambitious how to behave and what to avoid far more effectively than any etiquette book. A person who hosted a flawless dinner gained prestige. One whose party became gossip fodder was quietly erased from guest lists for months. Some households even used gossip strategically. Skilled hostesses invited talkative guests, the human equivalent of social media influencers, to spread favourable reports about their home, their cuisine, or their children's marriage prospects. A successful dinner wasn't truly over until the right people had been overheard praising it. This was the Victorian version of going viral. Of course, the gossips themselves were never immune. Every spy risked being spied upon. The same people dissecting others' curtains would find their own upholstery under discussion a week later. But that was part of the thrill. The dinner party was a revolving stage, and everyone took turns playing host, guest, and target. It was the one thing that united all Victorians, from Duchess to Draper's wife, the sheer joy of discussing someone else's downfall. As the carriages clattered into the night and the servants began cleaning up the wreckage, one could almost imagine the invisible threads of gossip already weaving their way through the city, connecting drawing rooms, whispering between parlours, and reshaping social destinies one anecdote at a time. Victorians didn't need the internet, they had dinner parties for that. While the drawing room above simmered with polite conversation and the faint scent of overbrewed coffee, the real action of the evening was taking place below stairs, in the roaring, chaotic, and faintly smoky underbelly of the Victorian household. Upstairs, guests discussed moral virtue over petit fours. Downstairs, servants discussed the guests. The contrast was divine comedy. For while the hostess fretted over whether her floral arrangements conveyed understated grandeur, the kitchen was a war zone complete with curses, clattering pans, and one footman weeping into the gravy. The butler smiled like a saint while mentally writing everyone's obituary. Below stairs, the dinner party wasn't a social event. It was survival theatre. The kitchen was the Empire's engine room, fueled by steam, sweat, and barely suppressed resentment. The cook barked orders like a general, the scullery maids darted like terrified sparrows, and the butler stalked through it all like a grim reaper armed with a corkscrew. Every clang, hiss, and shouted, "Where's the pudding mould?" echoed through the pipes, an ironic counterpoint to the dainty string quartet playing above. Timing was everything. Upstairs, dinner seemed effortless, course after course appearing as if conjured by angels. Downstairs, it was a miracle of improvisation. One maid fanned the fire to keep the roast alive, another polished silver with shaking hands, while the kitchen boy, permanently soot-streaked, ran relay missions between the range and the dumbwaiter. Plates were counted, wiped, counted again, and still somehow went missing. Someone always broke something, someone always cried, and someone, often the butler, quietly began planning their exit strategy to another household with fewer dinner parties and better pay. But despite the chaos, the servants knew their roles like a cast of professionals in a never-ending tragedy. The butler was the linchpin, the calm in the storm. His face betrayed nothing, not the missing napkin, not the underdone mutton, not the fact that the footman carrying the fish course had hiccups. To the guests, he was the embodiment of quiet dignity. To the kitchen staff, he was a walking volcano of contempt. His inner monologue could peel wallpaper. He smiled when Mrs. Pembroke declared her champagne delightful, but in his mind he was composing a full critique of her manners, her voice, and her perfume. The servants' true revenge came in observation. They noticed everything. The guests might believe themselves under divine scrutiny from polite society, but the real judges were below stairs. The maids knew who drank too much, who flirted too obviously, and who secretly stuffed rolls into their handbags. Gossip among the upper class travelled fast, but servant gossip travelled faster, through corridors, across mews, and down into taverns where no titled name was safe. The following morning, while the hostess recovered from exhaustion, half the local staff network already knew that Lady Wyndham's pearls were glass, and Mr. Fletcher fell asleep before the dessert. The kitchen commentary was brutal and unfiltered. When the cook heard the guests praising her delicate seasoning, she snorted, "If they tasted anything at all, it's a miracle." The scullery maid mimicked the hostess's falsetto greeting, "So lovely to see you," while swooning leftover custard straight from the bowl. The footman reenacted the guests' awkward bows. The parlour maid critiqued gowns. That colour made her look like a boiled ham. And the kitchen boy performed an uncanny imitation of the Colonel's drunken toast. Below stairs, everyone was a critic and a comedian. Of course, the greatest spectator sport of the night was watching the upstairs staff return between courses. Each descent into the kitchen was like a royal report from the front lines. "She said the soup was cold," one footman hissed, slamming down his tray. "And the lady in blue, she's already dropped her fork twice." "Twice," the cook, unimpressed, merely growled. "And I suppose she blames me for her clumsiness." Then, as if on cue, the next course went up, steaming and flawless, as though nothing had ever gone wrong. After the last dish had been cleared and the guests had retreated to applaud the evening's tone-deaf piano performance, the downstairs crew collapsed. Aprons hung like flags of surrender. The kitchen's once glorious counters were now a battlefield of crumbs, drippings, and broken dreams. The cook loosened her collar. The maid slumped onto stools, and someone opened a bottle of cheap gin for medicinal purposes. Laughter filled the air. Rough, exhausted, genuine laughter. The kind never heard in the candlelit serenity above. Yet even amid exhaustion, there was pride. The dinner had gone off without a public disaster. No dropped tureens, no undercooked game, no visible mutiny. For servants, success was defined by their invisibility. The smoother the night appeared upstairs, the more chaos they had conquered below. Their work was never acknowledged, but they knew, and their reward was simple, to mock the masters over cold pudding once the coast was clear. Some households were luckier, those where the master treated his staff decently, or at least paid on toast on time. But many lived under tyrannical mistresses obsessed with perfection. One wrong polish on a spoon could earn a scolding. One late dish, a dismissal. Servants developed thick skins and thicker humour. They survived through jokes, mimicry, and the shared knowledge that for all the wealth above, the real intelligence of the household was down here, among the people who actually kept it running. And of course, the next morning, when the mistress descended to praise the wonderful evening, every servant bowed and smiled serenely. The butler replied in his calmest voice, "We aim to please, madam," while silently composing a devastating internal review of her guests. The cook wiped her hands, muttering, "Aye, please them we did, though I hope their stomachs forgive us." And somewhere in the servant hall a maid whispered, "Same time next week then, God help us all." Because that was the beauty of the arrangement. Upstairs lived the illusion of grace. Downstairs lived the truth. And while the wealthy fretted over what their peers might say, the servants had already said it, louder, funnier, and far more accurately. The butler smiled like a saint while mentally writing everyone's obituary. When the final guest's carriage clattered off into the mist and the last delightful evening echoed down the street, silence descended upon the Victorian home. The kind of silence that only arrives after an event that has consumed both one's soul and one's savings. The chandeliers still glimmered faintly, the dining room reeked of extinguished candles and wilted roses, and the hosts stood like survivors of a polite disaster. The soufflé may have risen, but your bank account didn't. The morning after a Victorian dinner party was not glamorous. It was administrative. While guests woke up in their warm beds congratulating themselves on another triumph of social civility, the hosts awoke to find the wreckage of their finances strewn across the drawing room like battlefield casualties. Bills, receipts, and IOUs were everywhere, reminders that the previous night's splendour had been bought on credit and borrowed time. First came the butcher's bill. The menu that had so elegantly dazzled guests now glared from the ledger like an accusation. Turtle meat imported from Madeira, pheasant from Norfolk, fresh trout from Scotland, pineapples from Jamaica. Each one had come with a price tag more dramatic than the dessert course. The wine merchant's account was worse. Every bottle of champagne that had popped in triumph now whispered interest rate in the cold light of day. The family might have drunk claret, but now they owed in shillings, and plenty of them. Then came the wages. Servants who had worked themselves half to death demanded their due, and rightly so. Overtime pay, coal expenses, broken china, and the mysterious disappearance of 6 teaspoons, no one ever knew where they went, only that replacements cost too much, added up to another grim column in the household book. The cook needed more coal for the next week. The butler hinted that a new decanter was required, and the florist's boy arrived cheerfully at noon to collect payment for flowers that now resembled salad. Many middle-class hosts faced the post-party morning with the same ritual, one hand clutching the newspaper for distraction, the other rifling through pawn tickets. Jewellery, silver and heirlooms frequently went on holiday to the pawnbroker after such extravagant evenings. The mahogany sideboard might return to the rental shop, the borrowed candelabra might be whisked away, and yet somehow the guilt remained. The entire dinner had been a performance in financial self-immolation, and the reviews were mixed. For the truly ambitious, the morning's suffering was considered an investment. Hosting a grand dinner meant entrance into the invisible club of social power, assuming you survived it. The goal was to impress someone important enough to make the expense worthwhile, a wealthy relative, a titled neighbour, or perhaps a banker willing to extend credit out of admiration for your choice of centrepiece. But those victories were rare. More often, the aftermath was a grim balance sheet of overextension, accompanied by the sickening realisation that prestige couldn't be deposited into the bank. The emotional hangover was no less brutal. The hostess, who had smiled herself into near catatonia the night before, now collapsed into her morning tea like a wilted rose. The excitement had curdled into exhaustion. The husband, still reeking faintly of port and regret, muttered that perhaps next time, as something smaller. They both knew there would be a next time. In the competitive whirl of Victorian social climbing, the only way to maintain one's place was to keep entertaining. One successful dinner merely raised the bar for the next. Meanwhile, the drawing room bore the scars of victory. A wine stain bloomed defiantly on the carpet. Candle wax clung to the tablecloth like guilt. The piano lid bore faint scratches from the previous night's spirited rendition of God Save the Queen. The air was thick with the ghosts of compliments and the faint undertone of debt. Servants shuffled quietly through the debris, clearing the evidence of excess. For them, it was another morning. For the hosts, it was the morning after a war. And yet, amidst the fatigue, there was always the lingering question, was it worth it? Did Mrs. Hawthorne finally speak approvingly of the curtains? Did Colonel Fairchild stop mentioning his own wine cellar for once? Did anyone notice the chipped dessert plate that had been cunningly hidden at the far end of the table? The answers to these questions mattered more than any financial ruin, because in Victorian society reputation was currency, and one could not afford to appear poor in taste, even when poor in truth. Sometimes, though, the results were devastating. Newspapers of the time occasionally printed small social notices about families retiring quietly to the countryside, polite code for bankruptcy brought on by overzealous entertaining. Entire fortunes could vanish under the weight of etiquette and ego. What had begun as an attempt to impress often ended in foreclosure. More than one mansion's dining room chandelier had shone brightest in its final days, right before the creditors arrived. For those who survived financially, the psychological toll remained. Anxiety lingered. The gnawing fear that the evening hadn't gone quite as well as it seemed. Perhaps Lady Pembroke hadn't laughed at the right moment. Perhaps the soup was too salty. Perhaps someone had noticed that the silver punch ladle was borrowed. And so the cycle began anew. Another dinner planned, another round of invitations, another desperate bid to keep up appearances while the walls slowly closed in. By nightfall, the house would fall quiet again. The fire would burn low, the servants would retire, and the hosts would sit before the ledger, staring at numbers that mocked them more viciously than any gossip ever could. The candles were gone, the guests were gone, and the illusion was gone, leaving only the hard truth that Victorian hospitality was a form of self-inflicted theatre, funded by delusion and powered by social fear. The souffle may have risen, but your bank account didn't. In Victorian society, a dinner party was not simply an evening meal. It was a public examination in taste, wealth, and control. Every chandelier, every glass of claret, every crumb of bread was a declaration of who you were and where you stood. A successful dinner could vault a family upward into the delicate web of influence. A single failure could push them out of it permanently. There were no second chances in the empire of manners. Victorian success was 10% charm, 90% pretending your soup course didn't bankrupt you. Reputation was the invisible currency that governed every table. A dinner invitation was not hospitality, it was a transaction. The right guest list could open doors to patronage, marriage, and political favour. The wrong one could shut them forever. The art lay in precision, hosting the wealthy without appearing desperate, inviting the titled without appearing obsequious, mixing the clever with the fashionable in proportions that suggested effortlessness. That was the high-stakes arithmetic of Victorian society. Every guest's opinion carried weight far beyond the dining room. They left with full stomachs and mental notebooks. A lukewarm entree, an awkward pause, or an offhand remark could metastasize into rumour. The same lips that complimented the roast might whisper elsewhere that the lamb was slightly underdone, and so was the conveyamen. That single remark, multiplied across drawing rooms, could undo months of cultivated dignity. Reputation travelled faster than carriages and hit harder than debt. A triumph, however, was transformative. One flawless evening, seamless service, witty talk, a menu just exotic enough to be fashionable without vulgarity, could elevate a family from obscurity to acceptance. Word of mouth worked like currency exchange. Admiration converted into invitations, invitations into alliances. Society was a closed loop, but every successful host found a way to slip a finger into its turning gears. The terrifying part was that there was no formula. The standards were elastic, shifting with the whims of those already entrenched. What was elegant one month could be considered excessive the next. Pineapples once symbolised wealth. Later they were derided as ostentatious. Heavy drapery was respectable until the fashion for minimalism arrived, and suddenly one's curtains became a moral flaw. A dinner that impressed the gentry in spring could, by autumn, mark a family as embarrassingly outdated. This instability bred obsession. Households hired gossip scouts, discreet acquaintances who could report what the influential were praising or condemning that week. Cookbooks became tools of survival, etiquette manuals, sacred texts. The fear of humiliation shaped behaviour down to the molecular level. Hosts rehearsed greetings, practiced conversational transitions, and even choreographed their own laughter for the correct tone of restrained delight. A misjudged expression could read as arrogance, too much enthusiasm as insecurity. The middle class suffered most under this system. The aristocracy had history to protect them, and the poor had no pretence to lose. But those in between, the clerks, the merchants, the professionals, lived in constant danger of slipping. For them, social survival depended on illusion. Every dinner was an audition for belonging. The guests they sought to impress might never return the favour, but to be excluded was unthinkable. Being ignored socially was equivalent to death by starvation, slow, quiet, and absolute. Reputation was so brittle that entire lives revolved around maintaining it. Marriages were arranged with reputation in mind. Children were schooled not in intellect but deportment. Servants were chosen for appearances as much as ability, because a butler who poured wine with a tremor could discredit the entire family. Even mourning attire had to be precise. Grieving improperly was nearly as shameful as serving fish with the wrong sauce. When disaster struck, when a sauce curdled, a guest fainted, or a scandalous comment slipped out, the aftermath was swift and merciless. Invitations disappeared. Friendly nods at the theatre became studied indifference. Neighbours stopped calling. Families ruined by gossip often moved entirely, retreating to the countryside under the pretence of taking the air while quietly dismantling their social ambitions. London was full of such ghosts, households that had burned too brightly, then vanished without ceremony. And yet, the hunger for reputation was irresistible. Even those who knew the system's cruelty remained enslaved to it. The social climber's mantra was simple: better ruin from extravagance than disgrace from mediocrity. Each successful dinner emboldened hosts to attempt another, grander one. A new rival always loomed, a richer host always beckoned. A more fashionable acquaintance always shimmered just out of reach. The ladder of prestige had no top, only better wallpaper. The tragedy was that reputation could not be eaten, worn or spent, only displayed. Its rewards were intangible, yet its cost devastatingly real. A glowing review from Lady Pembroke or a favourable mention in a gossip column could sustain a family's pride for months, even as creditors circled like vultures. The illusion of standing was often the last thing left standing. When the candles finally guttered out and the host sat in the dim quiet, they were left with an unsettling truth. The dinner had been both victory and wound. The compliments echoed in their minds, but so did the expenses. They had risked everything, money, dignity, sometimes sanity, for a few hours of perceived equality, and yet they would do it again. Because in the Victorian world, survival wasn't about wealth or intelligence. It was about performance. Victorian success was 10% charm, 90% pretending your soup course didn't bankrupt you. For every duke holding court over a 12-course feast and a mountain of silverware polished to a blinding shine, there were a dozen middle-class households trying to copy him, armed with optimism, borrowed crystal, and a dangerously flexible line of credit. In Victorian Britain, social climbing wasn't an ambition, it was a survival strategy. The merchant's wife who learned to say entree without blushing could inch her family toward acceptance. The clerk who served claret instead of ale might earn a nod of respect, and together they would spend a lifetime chasing the illusion of refinement. Fake it till you make it was practically the national anthem. The middle class was the backbone of the Victorian economy, educated, ambitious, and painfully aware of its inferiority complex. These were the families who had money but not lineage, ambition but not instruction. They built their fortunes in factories, offices, or trade, only to find that wealth alone wasn't enough. Respectability required mastery of aristocratic rituals, so they studied the upper crust the way biologists study exotic animals. From a cautious distance, notebook in hand, trying to imitate every gesture without triggering ridicule. The dinner party became their proving ground. A successful soiree could lift a family from anonymity to whispered approval in the right circles. But it was also a minefield of potential humiliation. The middle-class hostess dreamed of candlelit grandeur, but lived in a semi-detached reality. Her drawing room was smaller, her servants fewer, her carpets less Persian, and more optimistically floral. Still, she pressed on. Invitations were written in looping cursive, menus copied from Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, and decorations arranged to suggest effortless taste, the kind that took 3 nervous weeks to assemble. The imitation was painstaking. A hostess who had never met a baron might still sprinkle her conversation with, "My dear, so kind of you, and quite the season, isn't it?" Her husband, meanwhile, practiced pronouncing French dishes that terrified him. "What is bouffe bourguignon? Never mind, and serve it." They bought imitation silver that gleamed convincingly under candlelight, rented footmen who didn't know their names, and prayed no one would notice the fish forks were actually dessert forks in disguise. The middle-class dinner was a masterclass in illusion. The table was laid to military precision, every napkin folded, every candle trimmed. Guests were ushered in with the confidence of seasoned aristocrats, even if the family's only servant, the overworked maid, had been bribed, with the promise of a day off and leftovers. The wine, often cheaper than it looked, was served with elaborate ceremony, as if its label contained a family crest instead of an import stamp from Bristol. And for those who could afford it, a rented piano stood proudly in the corner, though the only song it ever knew was the sound of financial anxiety. Of course, imitation came with hazards. The more elaborate the attempt, the greater the risk of collapse. One over-ambitious family in Bath famously installed imitation gas lamps for a dinner, ornamental only, lit by hidden candles. Midway through the meal, the wax melted through, dripping onto the guest's soup. Another host, determined to replicate an aristocratic 12-course menu, failed to calculate portion sizes properly, and served what one guest described as a series of polite appetizers followed by despair. But no matter how disastrous, each effort was viewed as noble. Failure was survivable. Simplicity was not. The upper classes naturally found all of this both flattering and hilarious. Newspapers of the time snickered at bourgeois banquets where the conversation was as overcooked as the lamb. Yet they also relied on this imitation game. It reinforced their dominance. By forcing the aspiring middle class to constantly chase perfection, they kept the ladder steep and the climbers exhausted. True aristocrats didn't need to host flawless dinners, they only needed to act as if they didn't care. The performance of indifference was their greatest luxury. For the imitators, every dinner came with moral peril. They had to appear wealthy without seeming gaudy, educated without being pretentious, and humble while clearly showing off. If they succeeded, they earned coveted invitations in return. If they failed, they became cautionary tales. To overreach was dangerous. To underperform was fatal. The only constant was exhaustion. The manuals didn't help much. Mrs. Beeton gave recipes, but not reassurance. Etiquette guides detailed endless don'ts. Don't mention money, don't laugh loudly, don't eat too heartily, don't compliment excessively, until conversation itself seemed like an obstacle course. The result was an epidemic of social anxiety disguised in silk. A man might spend his entire salary on a chandelier only to realize halfway through dinner that it was hung too low, forcing guests to bob like ducks every time they reached for the salt. Servants, as always, had front-row seats to this theatre of aspiration. They knew every secret, which dishes were borrowed, which debts unpaid, which linens frayed at the edges. They swapped stories below stairs about their employers' desperate performances, often with biting humour. Our mistress's French accent, one maid reported, could curdle the custard. Another boasted that her master had rented an entire wardrobe of evening coats just to impress the rector's wife. Yet for all the mockery, there was something oddly heroic about these imitators. They believed, against reason and ridicule, that refinement could be earned, that learning the right fork, the right tone, and the right wine could buy a kind of dignity previously reserved for birthright. Their efforts were clumsy but sincere, proof that aspiration, however absurd, is still a kind of courage, and occasionally it worked. A well-timed dinner, a charming remark, a borrowed chandelier, and suddenly the family was in. Invitations flowed, fortunes improved, and the children went on to marry up the ladder. The risk had paid off, but even for those who succeeded, the performance never ended. Once accepted, they had to keep pretending, forever poised, forever fragile, forever terrified of slipping back down into obscurity. For the rest, there was only the satisfaction of survival, and the faint comfort that, while they might never truly be aristocrats, they had at least looked convincing by candlelight. Fake it till you make it was practically the national anthem. By the height of the Victorian era, the true power behind the glittering dinner tables and fashionable facades wasn't gold, land, or even lineage. It was credit. The great unspoken engine of elegance was debt. Behind every flickering chandelier and every silk gown lay an unpaid bill politely waiting to destroy someone's reputation. The era may have worshipped propriety, but its real religion was pretending the invoice didn't exist. If denial were a currency, Victorians would have been billionaires. Credit made everything possible, and everyone nervous. From Mayfair to Manchester, shops extended endless goodwill to customers who appeared respectable enough to eventually pay them back. Tailors, florists, grocers and jewellers all offered goods on account, relying on the sacred Victorian principle that public image equalled honesty. If you looked refined, spoke properly, and owned a hat taller than your shame, you could probably secure a fortnight's worth of oysters and a piano stool on a credit. It was capitalism wrapped in velvet, friendly on the surface, predatory underneath. For the aspiring middle class, this was salvation and damnation rolled into one. Credit allowed them to live like aristocrats, at least until reality arrived in an envelope. They could buy French wine, lace curtains, and imported porcelain without paying a penny up front. The system thrived on illusion. The illusion that next month's income, promotion, or fortunate inheritance would settle everything. But of course it rarely did. For every gentleman who managed to clear his debts, there were 3 quietly selling heirlooms under the table. Merchants too played their part in this elaborate game of make-believe. Many actively encouraged credit purchases, and after all, nothing kept customers loyal like fear of exposure. A respectable shop in London's West End might boast, "We extend accounts to the most distinguished families," which really meant, "We know exactly who owes us and how much shame it would cost them to admit it." Those who failed to pay risked more than insolvency. They risked scandal. A shopkeeper's whispered disapproval could ruin a hostess faster than a burnt roast. The practice of buy now, panic later extended to every imaginable luxury. Dressmakers created elaborate gowns for women who hadn't yet paid for the last season's fashions. Milliners sold hats so large they could conceal entire unpaid bills. Furniture dealers lent drawing room sets for temporary possession, while wine merchants delivered crates of champagne to families whose only bubbly asset was their optimism. Everyone in society was performing solvency, and the audience, the rest of society, politely pretended to believe it. Even the aristocracy was not immune. Many noble houses were rich in history but poor in cash, forced to rely on London creditors to keep their estates functioning. Dukes bought carriages on credit, earls borrowed against family silver, and countesses commissioned dresses to be settled after the season. They lived in a world where being visibly wealthy mattered more than being solvent. As long as the chandeliers stayed lit and the gossip stayed flattering, ruin could wait until morning. For the merchants who served them, debt was an art form. Ledgers became novels of delusion, full of promised payments, assurances of remittance, and the occasional dramatic customer relocated. Some shopkeepers quietly sold their clients' debts to collectors. Others simply hoped the shame of public exposure would motivate payment. The London Gazette, the grim reaper of Victorian credit, regularly published lists of bankrupts, their names printed like tombstones of reputation. Reading it was a national pastime. Among the lower middle class, credit was even more precarious. Local grocers and tailors extended gentlemen's trust to clients who could barely afford rent. A missed payment might result in humiliation, or worse, the arrival of the debt collector, that most feared visitor in the Victorian household. These men were professionals in public embarrassment, knocking loudly and lingering long enough for the neighbours to notice. The sound of the collector's cane on the front door was the 19th century equivalent of a social death knell, yet denial remained the lifeblood of the system. Entire households existed in a state of collective delusion, convinced they were moments away from prosperity. The hostess ordered another dinner service in anticipation of better times. The husband bought a new waistcoat for professional appearances. The children were sent to expensive schools because education is an investment. Each decision was justified, rationalised, and tucked neatly into the mental ledger marked tomorrow. And then there were the pawn shops, the unofficial branch offices of Victorian finance. They were the quiet confessionals of the middle class. Each morning servants carried small packages wrapped in cloth, a silver spoon, a brooch, a candlestick, and to trade for a few shillings. The items would be redeemed when the next paycheck arrived, though often they never were. Pawn shops kept the illusions afloat, allowing families to appear respectable while privately disassembling their dignity. It was an unspoken economy of embarrassment, and it functioned beautifully. What made it all possible was secrecy. Talking about money was considered vulgar, therefore no one ever admitted they didn't have any. Debts went unmentioned at dinner. Husbands hid ledgers in their desks, wives hid receipts in prayer books. Servants, as usual, knew everything. They watched the packages leave for the pawnbroker, overheard the arguments about overdue bills, and silently calculated how many weeks of unpaid wages they were likely to endure before seeking new employment. Ironically, this entire system is fragile, hypocritical, and absurd, and helped sustain Victorian grandeur. Without it, the great illusion of stability would have collapsed. The glittering carriages, the silk gowns, the endless banquets, all powered by credit and denial. The very appearance of prosperity was the glue holding the empire's social structure together. Eventually the crack showed. Bankruptcies became so common that by the late 19th century they were almost fashionable, a sign you had at least tried to live well. Some debtors fled abroad. Others quietly reinvented themselves in new towns, new names, new illusions. But for every ruin, another family stepped up to play the same perilous game, because in Victorian Britain, appearances weren't just everything, they were the only thing. If dinar were a currency, Victorians would have been billionaires. For all their rules, rituals, and reputation management, the Victorians could never quite eliminate the chaos that made dinner parties human, and therefore disastrous. Beneath the lace gloves and stiff collars, there lurked the eternal truth of social life. No amount of etiquette could save you from embarrassment, spoiled oysters, or Uncle Edmund after his third glass of port. Dinner parties didn't end with dessert. They ended with whispered reputations in ruins. It wasn't supposed to happen, of course. Victorian hosts prepared with near-military precision, convinced that good manners could prevent catastrophe. But fate and faulty gas lamps had other ideas. When things went wrong at a dinner party, they didn't just go wrong quietly. They went down in gossip history. One of London's most infamous dinner debacles took place in 1864 at the home of Mrs. Clara Beauchamp, a socialite known for her overconfidence and questionable taste in seafood. Determined to impress her guests with imported delicacies, she ordered a batch of oysters that had travelled slightly too far and aged slightly too long. The evening began in splendour. Crystal glasses, candlelight, and polite conversation about colonial profits, and ended in collective gastric revolt. By midnight, several of London's most prominent guests were clutching their stomachs in agony. One fainted in the carriage, another swore never to dine east of Kensington again. Mrs. Beauchamp was never forgiven. The oysters, however, achieved local legend. Then there was the case of Sir Lionel Fairborn, a man whose taste for brandy was matched only by his lack of self-control. His dinners were famous for their opulence and infamous for their aftermath. At one particular soirée, after several generous toasts to Her Majesty's Empire, Sir Lionel rose unsteadily to make what was meant to be a stirring speech. It began patriotic and ended scandalous. He insulted the bishop, flirted with the bishop's wife, and knocked over the tureen of turtle soup, all before collapsing into the nearest fern. The guests applauded uncertainly, unsure whether to call a doctor or the police. His wife, unflinching, smiled and said, "My husband does so adore public speaking." But not every scandal involved bodily fluids or brandy. Some were far more delicate and deadly. The Victorians' obsession with hierarchy made seating arrangements as explosive as gunpowder. At one notorious dinner in Bath, a hostess accidentally seated a minor baronet's wife below a retired merchant's daughter, a breach of etiquette so severe it might as well have been treason. The baronet's wife spent the entire meal in frozen silence, refusing even the dessert. By the next morning she had told half of Somerset that her hostess knew neither her rank nor her place. Within a week, invitations to that household evaporated like gravy on a hot plate. Sometimes it wasn't the food or the furniture that failed, it was the people. Take, for instance, poor Mr. Edmund Crosley, an ambitious banker invited to his first aristocratic dinner. Nervous but eager to impress, he decided to tell a humorous story during the fish course. Unfortunately, his tale involved a dead dog, a chimney sweep, and a misunderstanding about trousers. The punchline and the silence that followed were equally mortifying. A countess dropped her fork. The host coughed violently into his napkin. Someone whispered, "Good heavens." Mr. Crosley was never seen in that dining room again, though his story lived forever in drawing-room gossip. Even the most genteel families weren't immune to culinary sabotage. In 1872, the Whitbys of Manchester hosted a dinner to celebrate their son's engagement. The evening was flawless until dessert. The ambitious new cook had decided to impress the guests with flaming plum pudding, a risky stunt involving brandy, matches, and faith. The flames, however, proved more enthusiastic than intended. The pudding ignited, the tablecloth followed, and the guests were treated to the sight of the groom heroically extinguishing the blaze with his coat. The bride's family interpreted it as an omen. The engagement quietly dissolved 2 months later. Then there were the social assassinations, the subtle, smiling kind. A careless remark could destroy more than a souffle. In one well-documented disaster, Lady Dennington asked her guest, Mrs. Howard, "How is your dear husband enjoying his new position?" The problem, Mr. Howard's new position was actually a euphemism for bankruptcy court. The silence that followed could have chilled champagne. The next morning, Lady Dennington sent flowers. Mrs. Howard returned them, wilted. Even servants sometimes had their revenge in spectacular fashion. During one grand dinner, a disgruntled footman, dismissed earlier that day but forced to finish his shift, accidentally poured gravy into the lap of his employer's least favourite guest. He then bowed, muttered, "Pardon, sir," and walked out, never to return. The guest pretended not to notice, but gossip spread faster than the stain. The newspapers, of course, feasted on such stories. Society columns mixed admiration with schadenfreude, reporting that Lady P's soirée was both memorable and mildly combustible, or that a certain financier's dinner ended with more than indigestion. These anecdotes, delicately worded and widely read, became moral fables of the era, cautionary tales reminding everyone that wealth could buy silverware but not salvation. Behind the laughter, however, was the constant anxiety of exposure. Every host feared becoming a punchline. Every guest feared association with failure. The true terror of a Victorian dinner wasn't poisoning or fire, it was gossip. To have one's name whispered with pity, to see one's address omitted from the next social calendar, that was ruin far worse than debt. And yet the scandals never stopped, because beneath all the rules and rituals, Victorians remained gloriously, unavoidably human. They drank too much, bragged too loudly, and tripped over their own formality. The more they tried to perfect society, the more their dinner parties revealed its cracks. It was, in its own absurd way, charming, an empire of etiquette forever undone by soup, scandal, and the occasional flaming pudding. Dinner parties didn't end with dessert, they ended with whispered reputations in ruins. When the last candles guttered out and the era of corsets, coal smoke, and compulsive politeness began to fade, what remained of Victorian society was not just an empire, but a legacy of performance, one built around the dinner table. For nearly a century, Britain's middle and upper classes had treated dining as theatre, etiquette as warfare, and appearances as oxygen. They called it refinement. History calls it financial self-sabotage with extra gravy. Those towering dinners, with their endless forks, suffocating formality, and catastrophic menus, were never just meals. They were acts of self-definition. Each bite of pheasant, each sip of overpriced claret, was a declaration. We belong here. The Victorian dinner table became a mirror that reflected the entire social order, gleaming, fragile, and slightly ridiculous. Behind every polite toast lurked terror, the fear of slipping down the class ladder, of being found out as less cultured, less wealthy, or simply less. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, cracks began to appear in the silver-plated illusion. Industrial cities swelled with new money. Newspapers exposed the hypocrisies of high society, and social critics, Dickens among them, gleefully skewered the absurdities of a world where morality was measured by table linens. The dinner party, once a symbol of order and respectability, began to look like a satire of itself, a ritual in which people bankrupted themselves for the privilege of pretending to be richer than they were. To modern eyes, the whole affair seems almost comically tragic. Families who could barely afford coal were ordering exotic fruits shipped from the colonies. Clerks earning £200 a year were commissioning Parisian gowns for their wives. Households were mortgaging futures on imported china, all for an evening of polite conversation and internal screaming. Yet to the Victorians, this was civilization itself, a moral duty even. They believed refinement kept chaos at bay. If the poor were starving in the streets, at least the upper class could console itself with well-folded napkins. Ironically, it was this obsession with display that helped dismantle the very system it served. The constant competition to outshine one another, to host more elaborately, to dress more elegantly, to dine more lavishly, had blurred the boundaries between old and new money. When everyone was pretending to be an aristocrat, the real aristocrats began to look ordinary. The merchant's wife in Manchester might dine as finely as a countess, and the countess might secretly be in debt to the same draper. Refinement became democratized, which, in Victorian logic, meant it stopped meaning anything, and as the empire aged, the extravagance began to feel hollow. The new century brought invention, industry, and impatience. Electric lights replaced candlelight. The middle class grew restless with its own charade. Dinner parties, once battlegrounds of decorum, evolved into social fatigue. Even etiquette books started to soften, advising natural grace over ostentatious display, a phrase that would have given an 1850s hostess heart palpitations. The theatre of manners was still running, but the audience was slipping out before dessert. Still, the spirit of the Victorian dinner lingers, wearing modern clothes. The setting has changed, from chandelier dining rooms to Instagram feeds, but the impulse is the same, to curate an image, to impress, to perform stability in a world of uncertainty. The influencers of the 19th century didn't post their oysters online, but they made sure the right people heard about them the next day. Every age finds its own way to host itself into exhaustion. The legacy of these overfed illusions can still be tasted in our social DNA. The fear of being out of place, the pressure to present success instead of substance, the way a simple gathering can turn into a performance of perfection. Victorians may have been caricatures of formality, but their anxieties were frighteningly modern. We've merely traded stiff collars for ring lights, calligraphy invitations for hashtags, and gossip over tea for comment sections. In truth, the Victorian dinner party was never just about food. It was about control. In an age of industrial upheaval, expanding cities, and social mobility, the dining table became the last bastion of order. Every course, every utensil, every rule was an anchor in a changing world. To host was to assert mastery over chaos, even if that mastery came at the price of sanity and solvency. Their rituals were ridiculous, yes, but also deeply human. Behind all the absurdity lay the universal longing to be seen, respected and remembered. And in that sense, the legacy endures. We still measure ourselves through our tables, whether that table is set for 12 or covered in takeout boxes. We still believe on some level that presentation equals worth. The Victorians just believed it louder, grander, and with more gravy boats. So when we laugh at their overcooked opulence and candlelit delusions, we might pause for a moment before feeling too smug. Because if the Victorians lived in an age of appearances, we live in an empire of them. They performed refinement with silver forks. We perform authenticity with curated lighting. The props have changed, the play has not. They called it refinement. History calls it financial self-sabotage with extra gravy.